everyone.
Good morning.
70 years ago, everyone in this room I'm sure knows that there was a historic event of great importance in modern British history. I'm sure everyone in this room knows that, but the question is, how many people outside of this room know this information? Unfortunately, not as many people as we'd like to. Last year, I was thinking about the 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush in London. I was thinking the anniversary is coming up, and I wonder what people know about this event. I asked around, I didn't do an official poll, I didn't do any research, I just talked to people. And I realised that many people hadn't really heard of the Windrush. Some people had heard of it, but didn't really know what it meant, or what the significance was. And then later on, I'm glad that I did do the book, because later on I realised that many people only know about the Windrush as a scandal. They don't actually know about it as a history. And I think that's a great failing on the part of people who do know, who have a responsibility to tell other people, particularly young people. So I decided to publish a book, and the book is called The Story of the Windrush. It's a small book, 48 pages, extremely easy to read, so that children and also adults can read it confidently and can focus on the story. It's written for, or I wrote it for ages 7 to 11, but what I've found is that children as old as 13 enjoy the book as well. Many adults enjoy it, and interestingly, a lot of older people, many of them who consider themselves part of the Windrush generation, enjoy the book because it's almost like something that wasn't there and hasn't been there for them when they were children. And that's also how I felt. Why wasn't a book like this available when I was a child? Why haven't there been more books about this very important event over the past 70 years? So that's the reasons why I wrote the book. It's a very simple publication, as I said, easy to read, written in a narrative non-fiction format. So it's a non-fiction, but it's told as a story, very loosely, through the life of Sam King, who was the first black mayor of Southwark. A fact which I found many children, including children in primary schools in the borough of Southwark, do not know. I've been into schools and I've asked who have heard of Sam King, and sometimes out of 200 children, only 5 hands go up. We need to do more to get this information out there. The book has photos from the era, it has maps, and it also has colourful illustrations. The adults seem to enjoy the illustrations more than the children, but the children have told me they find it very informative and it helps them to understand things. So far, the book is being extremely well received, and the main way it's being received and being found out about is through social media. There are people out there who are keen to get this history out there. Not all of them are historians, some of them are teachers, some of them are parents, some of them are ordinary people. And through social media, people have come to learn more and more about it. Since doing the book, I've had 2 BBC radio interviews, I've been featured in a local newspaper, and I've also been featured last week on the ITV London News. So that means many people saw the interview. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you now, but you can find it on YouTube. What this has shown me is that there is an interest in this history. As the previous speaker said, by not putting this history down correctly, or at least attempting to put it in another format, not just on the internet, we are cheapening the importance of this history. And that's why I felt it was important to publish the book. It is self-funded, but important to publish it as a hardback book in quality. It's very reasonably priced, and schools, I'm very pleased to say, have been finding it. But now, what I'm going to be doing is working in a more organised format to get this information out there. I believe that the initial success, it's only been 6 weeks since the book's been out, but I believe the initial success shows that there is an appetite for this type of history. We can do more to get that British history is the best. Thank you.
Again, fascinating and very important work, I think you'll all agree. And now we've got our final speaker in this section is Jeff Green, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his Black Americans in Victorian Britain, which is out with pen and sword. Yeah, or I can do this chair. Okay, cool.
Dreadful number of bearded blokes here today. Hello, my name's Jeff Green. I've been writing and publishing on the Black presence in Britain since 1982. I've had 4 books out, one of which is what I think is a definitive biography of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. All the publishers said there's no interest, and it sold about 4 copies, which let that be a lesson to us all. However, despite the Commonwealth aspect of this meeting, the book I have written, came out last month, was Black Americans in Victorian Britain. There is a chapter in it on Canada as a place where Black Americans had found some refuge in the Victorian period. It also includes Ireland. So, let me just read this bit out so you get some idea what it's about. Now, white Americans in Victorian Britain included Winston Churchill's mother, the industrialist Isaac Singer, whose Glasgow factory made over 10,000 sewing machines every week. The philanthropist George Peabody, whose buildings for the working classes still stand all over London, and Dr. Crippin, who was hanged for murder. Black Americans also had a wide range of activities, not that I found the murderer. Now, the Americans of African descent who were here between the 1830s and the 1890s included escaped slaves, entertainers, teachers, children, servants, doctors, authors, lecturers, undergraduates, campaigners for women's rights and campaigners against alcohol, and coal miners, factory labourers, Christian evangelists, a carpenter and a blacksmith. And they could be seen in hamlets and towns from the Isle of Wight to the coast of North East Scotland, Dorset, High Wycombe and Cork. My book uses numerous newspapers and also the memoirs of individuals, including David Dorr, who was a servant who was in England in 1851. I presented some new information on the Christian evangelist Zilpha Elor. That's a grand name to have. If you spend your time looking up Johnson, Williams and Jones, you know that Zilpha Elor is a good name to have. Anyhow, she didn't return to America in the middle of the 1840s, as everyone said. She married an Englishman in London, and she died in London in 1873. She suffered discrimination because she was a female preacher. There's the anti-slavery activist, Sarah Remond. She became a British citizen in 1865. That is also something which is new, and entries, encyclopedia, dictionary references to Sarah Remond need to include the fact she gave up her American citizenship and became British. There's John Brown, who escaped slavery in Georgia, and he lectured all around England. By the 1860s, he was a herbalist based in Dorchester. Isaiah Powell was a barrel maker in 1890s Liverpool, and his older brother William had qualified as a doctor in Dublin and worked in Liverpool hospitals into the 1860s. Dr. Powell died in Liverpool aged 81 in 1916. There's also an aspect which I find lovely, and that is F. Thompson, probably Ephraim, was a respected elephant trainer, and he usually worked on the continent. He died in Egypt, I think, from tuberculosis, and he's buried in Woking. His family still are around, his British family. There are also Black American and many Black West Indian lion tamers, which is an association which makes sense if you think that Africa is where lions live and black people live in Africa. But I can tell you there was a premium. If you were black and you wanted the job, you could become a lion tamer in Victorian England. I have no idea what the death rate was. Descendants of these individuals include the Virginia-born Nelson County, and the descendants still live in the Leicester area, and one lives in California. Alexander Crummell went to Cambridge University in the 1850s, and then he emigrated to Liberia. His son Sidney was educated in Warminster in Wiltshire. Thomas Pinckney, an escaped slave from South Carolina, worked with Crummell in Liberia, relocated to Canada, married an English Canadian in the 1860s, and they retired to Southampton, where they died in the late 1880s. Marion Lawrence was actually the daughter of a doctor in Washington, D.C. She joined one of those Jubilee choirs, which most of us who've studied Black history know about, Miss Jubilee Singers, etc. She toured to New Zealand and Australia, and in 1890 she married Henry Thrift, who was a retail merchant in Croydon. They got married in Croydon, they had 2 daughters, and she died in Croydon in 1907. Another core group included Isaac William Sisko, who married in Ormskirk in 1878. He died in 1905. His son, George Sisko, was an infantry soldier in the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment in the First World War. And there were imposters, people who exploited the sympathies of British audiences with claims to be working for black uplift in America, Africa and the Caribbean. The activities of black Americans in Victorian Britain were substantial, and I think, and I believe, that my book points the way forward for other historians to do some more digging. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay. Yeah, so we've got dramatising Black British history now, but I'm afraid, possibly due to my own interests, not at all. It would be more accurate to call it dramatising Black Tudor British history, because it turns out, I mean, we were talking to a few other people, but the people who are excitingly going to talk to us about their work today have all actually dramatised aspects of Black Tudor history. And I'm just going to move everyone slightly to the order that's on your sheet so that it's chronological, because as a historian I can't really cope with things chronological order. So we're just setting up a couple of things here that you good to go?
Yes.
So we have here, actually Lauren's question earlier about the Tower of London was quite a lead-in one, because she actually works with historic royal palaces and sometimes she even gets to dress up as a Tudor, of which I'm hugely jealous. But yeah, so if any of you know of any Black British history that has any link at all to the Tower of London, Hampton Court, what, the Banqueting House?
Banqueting House, Kensington,
Palace,
any
of that,
in Northern Ireland.
tell Lauren, and you never know, in a few months it might be being reenacted in full costume. So do tell Lauren about that.
Oh right, yeah. I'm so interested to talk to you.
But you've also worked as a historical advisor to Untold Arts, and they put on a wonderful play written by Hassan at the end there about Catalina, and I will leave you to talk about it.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the historical Catalina of Motril, who was the basis of the play Catalina that Hassan wrote. And then he'll take over and talk about developing the bare bones of her story into a piece of theatre. So for those of you who have never heard of Untold Arts, which I imagine is roughly 99.9% of you in this room, it's a theatre company that was founded by myself, Nadia Nadif, who is this person here, who was supposed to be here but unfortunately couldn't make it, so there she is in spirit. And Joel Sams a few years ago, with the objective of trying to take stories in the past and the present that have been marginalised or forgotten, apparently, and to bring them to the fore and to tell their stories. And the motivation for telling the story of Catalina came from Nadia herself, who had also
like myself and Ade here, worked with historic royal palaces in the past doing various historical workshops. And I'm going to read what Nadia sent me, which was kind of her motivating factor for telling Catalina's story. She says, as a mixed-race actress, I had sort of accepted without thinking that once graduating, I would be in contemporary plays, because subconsciously, people of colour didn't seem to exist in history or in plays until relatively recently. I see how wrong this point of view was, and am now actively trying to seek out stories about marginalised characters from history to the present day. So Nadia very much felt that her own story was being marginalised, that she didn't have a place within history, and so she's trying to put forward these stories in order to correct that, hopefully. Of course, we know in this room that it is not the case that there were no people of colour in Britain throughout history until the 1950s. In fact, there were many, many people in this country, as Miranda herself has told a very good version of these stories. Most famously, of course, is this gentleman, who, if you know Michael, you will certainly know, John Blank. And myself, at the time, Nadia was wanting to found Untold and had stumbled across a reference to Catalina, a Moor or a slave who was within the household of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. I was writing a book about the year 1509, which is when Henry VIII comes to the throne, marries Catherine of Aragon, and really all of that exciting period kicks off. And as part of my book, which is called So Great a Prince, I included a chapter looking at migration in both directions, because I think it's quite well known that the Tudors were explorers and went out into the world, but I think it's less well known that that was a two-way street, that there were many people within Britain in 1509 who were not born in Britain, or whose parents were not born in Britain, and yet who had a really important place within society, of whom John Blank is one example, and Catalina of Motril was another. The way that many people arrived into the country the way that many courtiers arrived into the country in 1509 was within the retinue of foreign powers, such as here Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish-born princess, and there was a very, very long-term tradition of the Queens of England being born outside of England. It was actually quite unusual to have English Queens of England. And Catherine of Aragon arrived in England in 1501 with a really very large Spanish household, in which there were also a number of Moors, people from Granada, because her parents, Catherine of Aragon's parents, the Catholic monarchs as they are, Ferdinand and Isabella, had reconquered, invaded, depending on your perspective, the area of Granada. And so Catherine brought with her Catalina of Motril, who is described as a slave of Catherine of Aragon. I'll be going a bit more into exactly what her role was, and also probably John Blank, and both of those persons arrived in England with Catherine themselves. Now there are these very tantalising little references in the descriptions of Catherine of Aragon's household and her arrival in England. Thomas More describes Ethiopians being part of Catherine of Aragon's retinue, by which essentially he means people of African origin, probably, because there does not seem to have been a huge amount of distinction in Thomas More's mind between the many, many different people who could be black in this era of history. And there's also references to two slaves within Catherine's household, and I decided to try and get to the bottom of who exactly these were and how Catalina fit into the story, to go back to lovely, sort of vaguely boring-looking beige documents in the National Archives. As probably any of you who've worked on the Tudor period will know, there's lots of resources online, the letters and papers, the calendars of state papers. But in the National Archives, they have transcriptions in Spanish of the works that are in the Simancas archives in Spain. And it was to them I went with my slightly rudimentary Spanish skills. I double-checked the key points with better Spanish speakers than I am myself, to try and get at Catalina's story. And sure enough, she is referred to in documents there. Catalina, who was slave of the most serene Queen of England. Catalina, who made the bed and served in secret matters of her bedchamber. And Catalina, who was there the first time the said queen was joined in one with her husband Henry. So repeated references to Catalina within these pieces of information about her household from 1501, excuse me, up to 1509. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but how does Catalina fit into this? Because actually Catalina has an incredibly important place in our national history. Because unfortunately I didn't take a photo of it, so I can't show you the exact little scribbling in the transcription. But Catalina is described as being very well informed, quote, of what went on in the marriage bed of Catherine of Aragon and her first husband, Prince Arthur. Now this is hugely important for the course of Tudor history and the course of our national history. Because 20 years after marrying Catherine of Aragon, so confusing. So after Prince Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, he died. 8 years later, she marries Henry VIII, the younger brother of Prince Arthur. 20 years after that, Henry VIII decides he wishes to divorce Catherine of Aragon on the basis that since she'd already been married to his brother, it was an invalid marriage. Crucially, the question then becomes, well, is it a valid marriage? Was she really married to Arthur? Did they consummate the marriage? Who is the most likely person to know? Probably the person who's dealing with her bed sheets. So the person who is physically involved with, quite frankly, the sticky business of what went on in the bedchamber. And the fact that in 1509, again, Catalina is there, the first time that Henry and Catherine are joined as one. This is, again, hugely important. And it's something that the online state papers slightly fudge, because possibly because it was transcribed by an English gentleman of the 19th century. He describes it as the first time that Catherine and Henry were married, the first time they were together. Whereas clearly in the Spanish it has much more of a sexual context. Like Catalina was there when they were joined as one. I think we know what this means. So Catalina, again, she would know, was there evidence perhaps that Catherine of Aragon was a virgin at that marriage in 1509? All of these bits of paper, all of these little bits of tidbit for Catalina were produced during the process of Henry trying to get a divorce, because Catalina was sought as a witness, essentially to try and prove that Catherine of Aragon was a virgin at that marriage. And as a result, we get these pieces of information about Catalina's life, solely through the fact that she is being sought for these divorce proceedings. So we know, for instance, that she was born in Motril in Granada, and in the bottom left of this image there are, in fact, the backs, I think, specifically, of two Moorish women in the city of Granada in the 16th century. We know, therefore, given that she was probably fairly young, she was probably of a similar age to Catherine of Aragon, then Catalina of Motril was probably involved in some way in the Reconquista. It is likely that that is how she became a slave of Catherine of Aragon's household, because she was enslaved during the reconquest of Granada. We also know that at some point after 1509, when Catalina was there for the joining in one, she returns to Motril. So she goes back to Spain, she marries a crossbow maker, she has 2 children, her husband Oviedo dies, and she goes back to Motril, where she is from, and that is where she is living in 1529, which suggests that almost certainly she has been freed, because in order to marry, to move freely, you need to have been freed in some way within Spanish society. It might even be the case that through the process of coming into England, which didn't have a modern code of slavery at that point, that ostensibly Catalina was freed by that process. What's particularly frustrating, though, is we don't know what happened next. We know up to the point in 1529 when she's being sought. We know she's living in Granada. But we don't know if she was found. We don't know if testimony was given. This might be somewhere in the Simancas archives. Someone with better Spanish than me, please go and look. That would be great. So it's a really frustrating process. We don't even know, if we're completely honest, what her name was, because Catalina is almost certainly a name that she took on when she entered the household of Catherine of Aragon. The name Catherine of Aragon in Spanish is Catalina, and it was very common for those who had been enslaved to take the names of their master or mistress in Spain at this time. So the bare bones of her story were so very slim in some ways, and yet she is so pivotal. She's in a position to know so much that there's this really tantalising element to her story. So in going from the historical Catalina to the dramatic Catalina, it was up to Hassan to try and weave those threads together to make a story, and he's now going to tell us how.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Good morning to you all. So when Nadia approached me with the story, I was really excited about it because I felt there was not enough representation of people of ethnic minorities in dramas, in historical dramas in particular. But I knew very little about the period or about the history. Lauren provided us with a wonderful package of the facts she just mentioned as a starting point. We then went into a kind of a workshop with a director, Daniel Goldman, who's a brilliant, very gifted director, and he got us to think about the essence of the story by just quickly writing what are the main headlines of Catalina's life that has stuck with us, having looked at the historical record that Lauren gathered. We then divided those into scenes based on different periods of her life, and we had a kind of workshop where actors improvised the various scenes. So one of the challenges of the story is that we knew so little about Catalina, and to just do a sort of straightforward historical play felt inadequate. So we came up with a device, which was the following. We started the play in 1593, long after Catalina's death, with William Shakespeare, sitting in a bar near the Globe Theatre, having a pint to enjoy his plays. And Oviedo Jr., the grandson of Catalina, comes with some actor friends, trying to pitch the idea of his grandmother's story to William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare initially is not interested. He says, I learned my lesson, and so should you. I'm all about kings and queens, baby. See, kings and queens get you in the West End. Maids get you nowhere. Know why? Because even bleeding maids won't pay to go and see plays about maids. And so, but Oviedo persists. He tells him, look, there is a king in the story. It's Henry VIII. He kind of entices him, and they begin to try and tell the story of his grandmother. So they go all the way back to how they were started. They enact Catherine of Aragon and Catalina being kind of playing as children, being almost on a kind of even playing field as children because they don't know their status yet. And then we take the story forward to 1501, which is when Catherine of Aragon was sent with her entourage, Catalina included. We imagine what it was like in a kind of comedic way, the procession waiting for the queen to arrive, and the different characters making different comments about the queen, including Thomas of More, who said the full quote is that he described the retinue, the people with Catherine of Aragon as hunchback, undersized, barefoot, pygmy Ethiopians, and we kind of mock him because he liked to wear a woolen shirt and is kind of itching as he says all of this. And then we get to the sex scene, and we had a lot of fun with it in the play. The sex is awkward, it's sort of fumbling, rather hilarious. Afterward, Catherine of Aragon confides in Catalina, I believe he has misfired in my belly button. That's not right, isn't it, Catalina? And Catalina replies, it is somewhat short of the mark, Your Highness. But then we develop the relationship between the two women. Catalina gives us some sort of sex advice, and so on. And Shakespeare becomes intrigued by the story. He wants to know more from the players whether the marriage was consummated. But at this point, they introduce into the story Oviedo Sr., the grandfather of Oviedo Jr., who's trying to sell the story to Shakespeare. And here we took some liberty with the history because it's not quite clear when Catalina met Oviedo, her husband. Did she meet him in Spain, or could she have possibly met him in England? And for our purposes, we had them meet in England. And really, Catalina in the play is quite ignorant because of her own history, because it's been suppressed. And she's been taken as a slave of Catherine of Aragon. And through meeting Oviedo, she begins to get glimpses of what her past might have been by his question, because he recognizes that she's a more like him. Then Arthur dies, and Henry VIII marries Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon goes through trying to produce a child. Catherine is there at all the failed births that happened and all the sort of aborted births that happened, and she shares with Catherine about it and the pain of all of that. And then, of course, Henry VIII begins to be interested in Anne Boleyn and begins to pursue her and begins to want to have the proceedings of the divorce. And that's where Caterina becomes very, very important, because she's the one that, as Lauren explained, had witnessed whether the marriage was consummated. So, of course, the key scene that we wanted to have would have been with Catalina and Henry VIII. Now, of course, historically, that's very unlikely that would have happened, and maybe would have been in the company of the king, but Shakespeare, who's kind of gets more and more interested in the story, goes, oh, it doesn't matter about the history, let's just have this scene. And we have a scene that is quite tense where Catalina is in a chapel praying, and Henry VIII comes and sits beside her, and she's sort of terrified of him. And he then begins to slowly kind of questioning her about what she knows about the marriage. And she realizes she is in big trouble, you know, if she doesn't, and he's pushing her to testify before Cardinal Wolsey that indeed the marriage was consummated. And then he quotes the passage from Leviticus: if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless. So he wants to use that obviously as an excuse, and he kind of tried to dissuade Catalina that way. And then she's put under pressure from the Queen herself, who wants her to testify in the opposite direction, so that the marriage is not annulled. So she gets caught between the King and the Queen. And eventually in the play she decides to escape with Oviedo. She's waiting for Oviedo to get on a coach and head to the harbor and get out of England and get out of this crazy situation where her life is sort of in danger. And then Oviedo arrives, but he lets her down because she realizes he has had an affair with another maid in the palace and got her pregnant, and then he can't quite join her. So she ends up going to Spain by herself. She's then found out, she's tracked down in Spain, and we have the scene towards the end of the play where it's almost this kind of, is she going to tell the magistrate what she knows or not? But it becomes a kind of magic realist scene where she talks to the Queen directly, and becomes not really about what the Queen wants, but about Catalina reprimanding her about having her history suppressed, and kind of Catalina taking a stand about that. And the play ended with Shakespeare promising to put on this play, but of course letting down the players and not doing that, but getting inspiration from bits of the story for his Othello. And that was sort of a commentary at that time in 2015 when we did about British theatre and how underrepresented these stories are. We are hoping to go forward with this play to develop it further, maybe turn it into a film. We're trying to get some film companies interested, and to do it as a kind of historical thriller about this woman, and at the same time maybe to expand on the stage version and incorporate some of the new research that has come out about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really love this story. Anyway, and I think Lauren sort of even almost sort of underplayed how significant it is, because obviously it's significant to those of us who are interested in the lives and loves of Henry VIII. But actually, as a result of the divorce, we became a Protestant country, which is a hugely significant element of our national story. So she was really there at that pivotal moment. So moving on in time slightly, so we heard about John Blank. AD wrote a play called The Court Must Have a Queen, which was performed throughout the summer at Hampton Court every day, twice every day?
3 times.
3 times a day for the whole summer at Hampton Court. So lots of tourists who were not expecting to see a black trumpeter in the Great Hall at Hampton Court when they wandered through aimlessly as part of some kind of coach tour, were confronted with this fantastic black Tudor in costume with a trumpet. And we've heard a bit about John Blank's life as a trumpeter coming with Catherine of Aragon, probably, in 1501, and certainly being at court in the early years of Henry VIII's reign. But Ailey's going to talk to us about how she weaved his life into a later period of Henry VIII's reign.
Thank you, Miranda. Hello everyone, I'm educationalists. I'm really interested in the conversations we're having here. A couple of months ago I actually talked at another event, it was actually Africa Rights. I was invited by the team at Africa Rights. Thank you. To talk about an art play from the Georgian era. So my first experience, does this chair move? My first experience of approaching historical work. I'm a playwright and actually was a journalist for a long time. And my focus was always telling untold stories. I was a journalist in the 80s and I worked for Black Art magazines, and our whole thing was there is a black presence, and I was chronicling it in non-fiction. Then I moved into storytelling for the stage and screen. So I've been working on another project from the Georgian era. I'll say a little bit about that later. So I put facetiously colouring in the national picture. And it's facetious, but it's true to an extent. But obviously it goes, as we know from recent issues, around colour, deeper than just what you look like. It's not just about the colour of the participants in stage or screen productions. It's to do with the heritage and the actual cultural story that they bring into it. So dramatising Black history for me is about I think improving is really what I'd say, improving our national picture. I've been an entrepreneur and a writer for 30 odd years. As I say, I was a journalist first, and I started Spora Stories in 2012. And I was a lecturer in creative writing. One part of my research is now historical fiction, which is an area that I've become very interested in. But similar to Untold Stories, Spora Stories, which is, I've truncated the word diaspora to Spora Stories. So Spora Stories is very much also about telling untold stories, which for me, sometimes we feel, of course, aggrieved at the underrepresentation of our stories. It's unfair, we all pay taxes, we'll contribute, for example, to the BBC. Are we fairly represented? The answer still, after many years of discussion, is no. But for me, it's not just about getting our rights, it's also about exploiting what I see as a huge commercial opportunity. So in today's session, I'm going to focus on my actual project, the Court Must Have a Queen, and the process, some of the highlights, some of the challenges, and the lessons learned. But for me, historical dramas are a UK success stories. Our Black British or African British story should also be part of. When I say historical dramas, I mean the whole heritage industry, which, again, until quite recently, I've not really been very interested in. As a journalist, my whole focus has been the now, here and now. That was my orientation. So my first few plays were about young Africans in the diaspora. One was about children going to Pandora's Box. My first produced play was about African heritage children being taken back to Africa or the Caribbean. Still a big issue. It did very well. My second play was actually London set. First one was set in Lagos. The one following that was set in London. It's a similar issue, educating African heritage children. And it was actually responding to my own particular issues at the time, because I have a young man now who was then a teenager. And I was going through a lot of the issues that parents trying to raise and safeguard our children in London were dealing with. But I then became interested in historical dramas through my project around Phyllis Wheatley, and also through this John Blank project. And I'm really seeing myself as helping really work within the creative industry to drive growth and jobs for the future, including the exciting stories of African and Black Britons. I don't think it's something we say to the BBC, oh, bleating, help us. We're saying this is a commercial opportunity. My earlier incarnation before doing journalism was I was actually an entrepreneur and I started my own business. And I've always had an orientation which is about audience. I'm audience-centred. And I'm absolutely convinced that there is a larger audience for what's often referred to as marginal or minority art. My first job was for an organisation called the Minority Arts Advisory Service. Doris Thea and others, Patrick I can see, will remember those days, and Kwame. The Minority Arts Advisory Service, MARS, and that was in the 80s. And even at that point, I thought, why are we calling ourselves minority? We're a global majority. In this particular configuration, obviously numerically we're a minority. But my mentality was always, these stories had agency, these stories had traction. And it was actually funny, on the train I bumped into a friend of mine who was just writing his first play. And he said to me, oh, how do you know when it's good? And I thought, well, you can never judge yourself. My mum always said, you can never judge yourself or see yourself. But you always know when you're engaged. And I always believe that we're all essentially the same, lots of differences. But if I'm really interested in a story, I know I can get lots of other people interested. So that's been my premise. It's an opportunity, a commercial and creative opportunity. Looking back is, as I say, new to me. My early work was very contemporary. My first period play project is a play about Phyllis Wheatley, and it's still in development. The first period piece which has been produced is, as Miranda said, The Court Must Have a Queen, and it was on for a long time, and it was on quite often during that long 9-week period. And I saw it about 5 or 6 times, and Michael joined me, and actually Miranda came on one occasion. In fact, Michael probably saw it as many times as I did. He was always there. The cast got to know very well, and he also helped us developing the material. But this whole idea of looking back, it's interesting to me that I've suddenly become, and I am, quite obsessed with history now. I mean, for example, Henry VIII, he towers over everything. So if you do a play about, for us it was much to do with John Blank. And then Michael said, oh, Addy, you've gone to the dark side. Because I got so interested in Henry VIII, I became really interested in the whole world of the Tudors. So for me, this is it's like a brave new world, frankly. And because of the work that Michael's done, because of the work Miranda's done, I'm able to draw on the historical research, and I've got, less research skills than many of the historians in this space. So we, as a playwright, and most of us creative writers, we really rely on your skills and your, it's a lot of work, the effort you put into digging up all this material. So Phyllis in London is a work in progress. We've had 3 readings so far. And I'm only mentioning this because it really is the first time I came into this looking back type of story. And I was interested in Phyllis because she's the first, and many of you will know, the first African heritage writer to be published, to publish a book, a collection of poetry. And that was in 1773. And I actually lecture, as I mentioned, at the University of Greenwich. And my office in the old Royal Naval College, King William Court, is one of the places she visited. She came to publish the book in 1773. And she visited the Painted Hall, the Tower of London, and all sorts of other historical sites. So I walk into my office, and I actually think of Phyllis walking up those same steps which she actually did, which for me is quite amazing. It's very recent to me, is what I'm saying. It's very living to me. It's not back in the past. I can imagine her. Greenwich, as we all know, has a lot of connections to slavery. Deptford was one of the main ports for some of the vessels. And I think quite near to Deptford, somebody will correct me, weren't there factories creating some of the armoury, the metalwork? Yeah. Woolwich, that's it, Woolwich. So Phyllis in London was my, if you like, entry point, my, what do they call it with drugs, your gateway drug, to the Tudor period. And we had readings so far. The point about Phyllis is, I was originally interested in her because as an African woman writer, I'm interested in other African women writers. I'm interested in my tribe as writers. So this is how I've come into period storytelling. So The Court Must Have a Queen, so this isn't a very good image. But it was a big production, is the first thing to say. I hadn't had any contact with historic walled palaces. I knew of Miranda's book, and I knew of Onyeka's book, Blackamoors, I think it's called. And funny enough, some friends of mine had sent me, even before I was approached by Hampton Hall, some information about the books, just thinking this might be material for a production. So I'd kind of been gently primed for this whole new world. And I'd heard about John Blank just through Black history and stuff like that, just general stuff. As you can see, the play had Henry's image as our protagonist story. But I'm interested in Henry, but I'm also interested in the wider. I'm trying to bring in and integrate the story into wider issues. Here's just a couple of images. As Miranda said, it was a really lavish production. The costumes were extraordinary. John Blank was played by Jack Benjamin. He's actually an actor musician. Now, because we're creating the Tudor court and we're looking at Henry VIII as obviously well, I'll come to that later in terms of the characterization. But we wanted to hire not just actors, is the point. We hired actor musicians. So most of the performers were also musicians, as well as being trained actors. So I invented a character. Michael and I have had conversations about his mother. So some people, and Michael's one of them, say, oh, come on, Ade, impossible. Well, as Hassan said, we can invent, we can create, we can, not twist, but we can tweak, let's say, the record. So I wanted a black female in the story. In historical records, at that point in time, John Blank would have been somewhere, he's disappeared from the records from 1514, is it, Michael? Something around that period. 15.
Well,
Right, thank you.
January
Or even more precise.
14th of January.
So the story is set in a particular historical moment. I know that she's probably not, she wasn't there, but I wanted her there. So I'm God when I make my plays, so I decided she'd be there. So I was the process. I was approached to be part of the workshop in July 2017, and it was out of the blue. I've got no pedigree in this era, or even in really historical writing. But somebody had read this is, other people who are playwrights, I know there's some of you writers. Somebody reads something, they like it, and then they come to you. So somebody had read Pandora's Box, which was my first play, very kindly liked it, and came to me and said, would you like to be part of a workshop? Never done this before, this was completely new to me. Said yes, wasn't just come along and, we'll take your time and your expertise, they were offering to pay me. As a writer, that's all very nice, when people say development and they'll help and pay you, that's unusual. But that's also, a whole new world for me. Historic Royal Palaces is not a poor organisation. Great. So they invite me to a workshop. I spent a few days at Hampton Court. And again, I hadn't been to Hampton Court since I was a child, literally school trips. So it's like 30 years since I've been to, I grew up in West London, so it wasn't terribly far, but I hadn't been there for many years. So it was very nostalgic, actually. It took me back to my school era and running around those, huge spaces with my friends. So we spent a few days at Hampton Court with another writer. Some of you may know the 39 Steps, Patrick Barlow, is a playwright. It was a West End show. Really lovely guy, and he was the other writer invited. 2 directors. Who was the other director? I can't remember. There were 4 of us all together. And they basically gave us a little room, the little studio space downstairs in Hampton Court. And we just started throwing ideas around. And they came to us with certain ideas. They said, well, we want to take John Blank's story make it more of a performance piece. So they gave me that idea, but they also talked about Sophia Singh, who some of you will know is one of the suffragettes she was erased from the film that was made a few years ago. But it's very prominent, very well documented, resident at Hampton Court. What were the other ideas? Just loads of them. They were just like brainstorming, just throwing stuff at us. And we would chat about the thoughts we had. We met 3 or 4 curators, Lucy Worsley, Tracy, yeah, sorry, you know them all. They're all people who know you. Because they all mentioned Miranda and they all talked about the John Blank project. Again, so I'm a newbie to all of this, I don't know all the names. And they were very, very warm, and they just kept almost saying, when people look at you and say, we need to get past this white Tudor story. So I kind of, all right, fine, that's something I'm happy to help with. And I met other members of the team who were doing various other projects. And we actually spent 2 days just wandering around. Hampton Court is massive, those of you who've been. I don't think I've actually still, having been there several times, been to all different nooks and crannies. I still haven't been to the lawn tennis thing, which is somewhere there. So then we went away, we spent this week, and one of the directors, who turned out to be the director I worked with for the actual play, and I sat down and just did some more brainstorming. And we sent away some ideas. And there was a long silence. Again, the writers in the room will know this very well. And I just left it. I went on to other projects, because I was thinking people are ready and want it. That's fine, they'll come back to me. And luckily they did. I just had an email saying, yep, we want you to write the play. But it wasn't one of the ideas that I pitched. The main idea that Sam and I, the director, wanted to do was the idea about John Blank. We were all really fascinated by him. But they came back with a brief. And the brief was, we want to tell the story of the period in 1538, they asked me to write. I actually changed the date. When all the ambassadors from around Europe were flocking to the court, trying to fix up, like the historic blind date they used to call it, marrying Henry off to a new wife, after Jane Seymour had perished in childbirth, I think, a few months earlier, or a few years by that time earlier. So I was given 6 characters. That's not a bad number. If you're producing a play, you can do quite a lot of dramatic stuff with that. And they said we have to have John in it, we have to have Henry in it, and we have to have Cromwell in it. So those are my triumvirate, those are my 3 main characters. So I've got to concoct some sort of scenario which gives all of these characters stuff to do, interesting stuff to do. I wanted his mum in, so I said, all right, character number 5, 4 is going to be, let's make her up, Maria, I call her. In fact, I first of all gave her a Muslim name, then I realised, as you said, she would have changed her name once she joined the cast. So I think she was, I can't remember what I first gave her, but it changed to Maria. And then I wanted another female character, so we decided to have Henry's, and she was someone who was in the court for 30 odd years, the nursemaid to his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, what was the youngest boy? Edward, right. So she's another female character. And the sixth character was. Sorry?
The ambassador.
And I always forget the ambassador. So I'm interested in politics. I'm not particularly, involved in it, but I'm interested in those negotiations. And we're talking about marriage treaties. All of the ambassadors would be the people. So we brought out the German ambassador. And we chose the German ambassador because for all the people who were competing for the hand, as it were, it was Anne of Cleves' people who got the deal. And they gave me the date 1538, but I changed it to 1539 because that's when the Clevian delegation actually arrived. So I then developed a two-page outline. I had meetings with the producer. And that was Kat, lovely, she's become a friend, Kat Buffery, who was at the Tower of London and Hampton Court. She's now doing something else. Curtis Lindsay, who's the director at Hackney Showroom. We revised the outline. It was just very much the traditional development process, except usually if I'm researching stuff, I have to do it all on my own. And I was really, really fortunate because they had a treasure store of materials, books, and of course the artefacts at Hampton Court. So Miranda's book was invaluable. The John Blank project, Michael's project, was invaluable. And I did 3 drafts of the script. But I really was conscious that I was extremely fortunate because I didn't have to really make a huge amount up. I had to make up how it all happened. But there was so much material, so much resource, and I think there's going to be more. But I really can't state how much value there is in what Miranda and Michael have been doing for several years. I'm like a newbie to the sector, and I just want to acknowledge dependence on their work. So it was a very well-resourced show. The production, that was the process. The production, 6 weeks of rehearsal is really quite a lot for a 30-minute play. But again, I really felt Hampton Court wanted to make this. Well, they do this I think with other productions, but they were very invested in this show. We had lots of production support, assistant stage manager. It was, frankly, most of my plays have been very cheap fringe projects. This was a whole different story. So these were the 3 main characters. One thing that was quite striking for me was also performing at the Great Hall. Again, I've never done site-specific work, so that was really interesting for me. The work where we were setting the story was going to be performed in the actual spaces where the discussions, the conversations, the conflicts took place. That was mind-blowing. It still is mind-blowing for me. Those of you who have been to the Great Hall, it's an astonishing space, and the tapestries that were on the wall in 1539 are still there. I mean, that's just extraordinary, isn't it? I find it extraordinary. So the challenges and the highlights. Lovely cast, fantastic, terrific director, etc. I've become friends, actually. I had a reading of a play about Windrush nurses a few weeks ago, and the woman who played the mother, John's mother, came and did the reading. We've developed real, interest in this whole thing about telling our stories. And I got a lot of support from the cast as well. When, cast members come to you and say, "Oh, I've been reading this. Why didn't we add this to the character?" I've never really had that in terms of my productions. But that's the sense of everyone being invested. And I don't mean just the black performers. I think the white performers became really interested. And again, that was my instinct, that people would be interested in if it's a good story. And we were all, the woman who played the mother, the nursemaid, Yvonne, has emailed me recently. We want to develop it. She's interested in the character. She's coming up with ideas for what could happen to this character in terms of the dynamics of the situation we put her in. And again, the wardrobe at Hampton Court. Michael Miranda saw the play. Didn't it look amazing? It was just, the costumes were just extraordinary. Just, you can go online, I haven't put too many pictures here. But I think there were and are always challenges. And one of the things that was noticeable, and Michael did point this out, we needed much more interpretation. Can you read that? Is it clear? No, sorry. We needed much more interpretation. Flyers, for example. I don't know what happened. I know there were lots of internal changes, and it's staff stuff, isn't it, always?
I'm also a freelancer, I should say. So
Yeah.
Say it on.
No, I mean, there were staff changes, which meant that we didn't get as much interpretation. And I think it was quite upsetting for me, for example, when a member of the bookshop staff said to a friend of mine, like some of you who do know Black History, Avril Nanton brought an entourage. She's always travelling with lots of her supporters. She runs a workshop. And she went to the bookshop and asked about the play, and she was told that John Black was a fictional character. And I was quite, I felt like that. And I did take it up with the people I was working with, and they were quite shocked as well. But I think that's an issue to do with the institution just training the staff as well as putting on the show. Equip your team to help tell the public about what we're doing. We wanted to publish the play text, that didn't happen, I was disappointed about that. I think Press and marketing. Now this is an interesting one. Hampton Court has, I think it's 8,000 people every Saturday and every Sunday during the summer periods, which is ridiculous. Normally if my plays run in a fringe theatre, 100, 200 seater. This was a whole other scale. So on the one hand, it's quite fair to say we don't need to do press and marketing. However, Anne Boleyn's story at the Tower was on at the same time, and there were posters. Did you see the Anne Boleyn posters all over London? Buses and tube. And I felt jealous, and I kept saying, what about us, what about us? So there was an issue of me feeling a little bit neglected and unloved because of the publicity that we, I think, could have had. But we did have great audiences, so I can see their point of view. We didn't need to promote it because people are here anyway. And as Miranda said, it wasn't a standard theatre audience. We'd have tourists who, frankly, didn't have much English language. And so they would be interested, hopefully, and were. They stayed because of the visual dynamics of what was going on. But again, that was a real education to me. Writing for an audience, first of all, which they're not necessarily English speakers, but also they probably don't particularly, they're just wandering around because they're in England. They're not particularly invested in English history. Most people have heard of Henry VIII. He's a global figure, an icon you could call him. But then it was a great challenge, and I think quite rewarding to see that people did stay. Because often they warned us when we were preparing. People will come in, stay for 5 minutes, and then wander off because they want to see, the chapel or wherever. But it was nice to see that people actually stayed. At some points, the Great Hall was just packed. Now again, as an artist, that's really rewarding, and I think it vindicates my point that if you're telling stories that have, and people would have walked in not expecting to see black people in these situations, and we didn't have anyone come to any of the team saying, oh, that was made up. They went with the story, which was again a really interesting thing. People didn't have a resistance to this. When they asked for clarification, they may have been misinformed, but there was no sense that this could not have happened. There was more a sense of tell us more, this is interesting. So again, the commercial imperative and the commercial potential is there. I think I've got to wrap up soon. So the lessons, I think it was for me as a writer to say, it was a great experience overall. Had a really nice dynamic with the team, have continued to be in touch with them. Actually, we're talking with the Tower of London about doing the Phyllis project, because someone mentioned the Tower of London. Phyllis was a visitor there, and she's actually documented, they have some images of famous people who visited the tower, and she's there. So that's another project I'm working on. I think staff issues, every institution will have its issues. It was just changeovers, meant that some of the marketing aspects could have been improved. And I think it's a lesson to me. Again, because I was hired as a writer, I thought, well, I'll just do my writing side, although I do know about press and marketing. And I think the lesson is next time, just get involved and not assume that it will be done. Take more charge. And I think we did need to be more proactive. Now, having said that the audiences were huge, whenever there was a strong black contingent, the cast would come to me and say, are those your family and friends? Because I was known for bringing, Michael and Miranda came as one of my entourage, my entourage. So I'd bring people in, and so it got to a point, so that told me that there weren't as many times as there could have been when there were large numbers of African audiences. And again, I think we should be more proactive. But I can actually also put myself into their shoes, because they're saying it's a tourist space, so it's just for whoever wants to come. But I think if we're telling untold stories, I also want to reach out to us, basically, to all of us. So I think it's appetite now, it's whetted my appetite. Really, really, almost neglecting now, here and now. Having been a journalist for many years, I feel like I'm just wanting to go back and tell these stories about history, historical stories. And my goal is to contribute black stories, as I say, to that lucrative genre of historical fiction in a way that harnesses their commercial potential. I don't see why it shouldn't be good for us and also good for business. Thank you all very much.
Great, thank you.
Shall I sit?
Is that where is there not a chair?
Are you moving?
Maybe you can
I can
swap.
stand there.
Shall I sit here?
Right, so finally for this panel, we're going to hear from Rex Sabano. Rex is an established writer and playwright, and most recently on Sunday night, I don't know if you caught it last Sunday night, his play The Moors of England went out on BBC Radio 3. It's in the kind of evening drama slot. And we also recorded a little discussion between us about the play afterwards, because I think some of the history behind it, in the same way as we've heard from the other speakers, has been untold, and maybe the radio audiences wouldn't really understand which bits were made up and which bits were fact. And the play itself, as Rex will tell you, it features black servants in the household of Sir Robert Cecil in the dying years of Elizabeth I's reign, when there's a lot of politics going on at court as well. So, over to you, Rex.
Hi, I'm Rex Urbano. I'm a writer, and I wrote The Moors of England, which is available to download on BBC Radio 3. Before I was a writer, I was an actor, and I was lucky enough to go to the Royal Shakespeare Company for my first job. And actually, the first day of rehearsals, we went to Hampton Court for research. That's the RSC for you. And so I was playing what's called a spear carrier. Someone in the background holding my spear, I think it was this hand, in the back of the court. And I'd just come out of drama school, so I was really method. I kind of wanted to know my character's inner voice, what he ate for breakfast and everything. So, but I wasn't quite sure whether it was cross-casting or colour-blind casting. I mean, I had a pretty standard comprehensive education, so black people didn't arrive here until Windrush, and before then maybe slavery. That's what I knew. So I went to my director and I said, is it cross-casting? Because black people didn't exist in this time. And then we did a show and tell. At the RSC you have 7 weeks rehearsal. So 2 weeks of that around the table. And you discuss the play, and then you have a show and tell where people bring research in. So one actor brought in the picture of the Westminster tournament. And in it, there was John Black. I'd never seen him before. I'd never seen the picture before, but that was my character. And it had a profound effect on me. It added to my cultural esteem, but more importantly, I belonged in the play. I belonged in the play, and even more so, I belonged. And that was really profound for me. So after a stellar career in theatre, and television, and radio, is someone laughing? I became a writer, but that experience of telling black British stories kind of stayed with me. I wrote a couple of plays on radio, and I wrote a play called Lovers Rock, which was about living across fire. And after I did that, I was looking for another project to write about. And so I came across the John Black stayed with me, so I thought, let me write about the Elizabethan period, maybe John Blank's life, maybe I'll write something about that. And then I came across the Proclamation of 1601, which was a proclamation allegedly written by, as I knew then, Elizabeth I, expelling black people from this country. And I thought, yes, that piece of racist legislation, I'll write about that. Yes, getting rid of black people back to their own country. And I thought, brilliant, that's my play. So I did some more research, and I couldn't really find that much on it. There was no books at the time. There was a few articles here and there, but nothing really written about it. There was a few websites saying that it was racist and it was this and it was that, but nothing else. And so I dug some more, and then I found some articles. And one of the articles that I found was written by Brandon and others that stated that this expulsion might not have been racist. And that intrigued me. Because then I was really fired up with the racism element. Finding out it could have been something else was something that I desperately wanted to write about. I wanted to tell the full story. It wasn't about writing about history, it was writing about the correct history. We haven't got very much black history in the syllabuses. So I thought, well, might as well do it right rather than being sensationalist about it. So I did some research, and I pitched it to Radio 3. So this is 2012. And I pitched it to my producer, and I didn't hear anything. So that would have meant a no. So I decided to turn it into a play, a theatre play. But then as I was doing some research, I realised that the proclamation didn't, in layman's terms, become law. So it didn't actually happen. There was no expulsions. So I wondered why. And I realised that doing my research, the proclamation was unsigned. So actually Queen Elizabeth didn't sign it. So how did it come into the annals and was not signed? And then I found my first dramatic point. What if someone like John Blank, who stopped this proclamation from being signed and saved us? And that's another dramatic point. So the original pitch had John Blank in it. So I did some more research, and I realised that the Prime Minister at the time, the person who probably could have written the proclamation, was someone called Sir Robert Cecil. And he was the Secretary of State. And so some of the research that I did alluded that he might have written it. But might is quite enough for a playwright. So I kind of thought that he might have written it. And then in some of the research that I did, I found out that he, Sir Robert Cecil, had a black servant. Oh, wow. So Sir Robert Cecil, who was to write this racist proclamation, had a black servant. So as a writer, that's another dramatic point. What if the black servant, who I found out to be Fortunatus, stopped this proclamation? Then I had something to go on. I had a story. And as the other dramatists here, it's all about story. It's all about, in order to get the education, the facts, the history, an audience has to adhere or be connected to the story. So I thought, well, that's a good story, this stopping of this proclamation by this person called Fortunatus. But I didn't know anything of it. And how did I know? How did they know that he had a black servant? Well, the only reason they would know is that it was in the burial records. So he was buried in 1601. And for his master, Sir Robert Cecil, to bury him, he must have had some kind of relationship, close relationship. He must have been a valued member of the household. That was another part of the story. There was a relationship. So I thought, oh great, okay, so he's buried in 1601. And then I found out I couldn't find out his birth records, but I found out when he was baptised. He was baptised in 1570. So at 17 years old. So I gleaned an age, and he's probably about, I can't remember the age now, but I found out his age as well. So I had something to go on. But if you're writing a historical drama, a play as it was at the time, that I needed more than that, and I had nothing. And it was really frustrating. It's frustrating as a black Briton. It's frustrating as a Briton to find out there are pockets of your history that are blank, or John Blank. See what I did there? All right, okay. That's why I never made it as an actor. Right. So then I read some books. I got Onyeka's book, Black and Moors. Miranda's book hadn't come out yet, but I had a lunch with Miranda. She talked at me for an hour and a half about history, and it was really interesting because Onyeka and Miranda were so passionate about the historical side, and that made me passionate about the storytelling side. So I got some money from the Arts Council and was able to develop it a bit more. But I was missing great big chunks. I was missing great big chunks of history, and also I didn't want to make up history. I mean, I didn't want him to come across like John McClane, kind of, swashbuckling his way, and he didn't want to make anything up. So that was quite tough. I had a beginning and I had an end, but I had absolutely nothing in the middle. But I wanted to make him a character who was authentic, who was of his time, and part of it was because he was of his time, would he be able to stop the proclamation? I mean, he had access, but would he be able to? Would a normal servant be able to stop this proclamation? So that was part of the problem. So anyway, so I decided to, in building up this character, the character of Fortunatus, I had lots of stuff on the Cecils, Sir Robert Cecil. I had lots of stuff on the proclamation and how it came to be through research. I had, so what I did was I tried to take stuff from the Cecils and the proclamation and add it dramatically onto Fortunatus' life. So Robert Cecil, he was the Secretary of State. And if you've seen Richard III performed anywhere, they would have him with a hunchback and deformed, unfinished, all that kind of stuff. The actor who played Richard III for the first time, he would have been someone like someone famous, and the portrayal of Richard III, he would have been doing an impersonation of somebody. And the impersonation, I think, don't quote me historians, I think he was doing was Sir Robert Cecil, because Robert Cecil had a hunchback. They called him a toad. They called him, there's a bit in the play that says that he doesn't look like his portrait. In his portrait, he's kind of upstanding, but actually, he was hideous, and there was like lots of libels and songs written about him to say how hideous he was. So, but he had a daughter, and his daughter was also had the same deformity that he had. So, I thought in building the Fortunatus character, I would have Fortunatus have a son. So the whole play would be about fathers and sons. And also one of the people who wanted to petition Sir Robert Cecil to have this proclamation was Sir Thomas Shirley. And he was this privateer kind of guy, but his sons were privateers, and they went around the world on pirate ships or whatever. So I thought, so I linked Sir Thomas Shirley and his son, Sir Robert Cecil and his daughter, and I made Fortunatus have a relationship, or a bad relationship, a dramatic relationship with his son as well. So with that, I was building things together. So it seemed, to a certain degree, that I was telling the story of Fortunatus, but it was mirrored with the other characters of the time. So Fortunatus, the things that I did know of him were that he was, his name was Fortunatus, and he was baptized in 1570. And if you know anything about the period, baptism, they had to be baptized into the Protestant religion because of the country and the turbulent religion that flip-flopped from one to the other after Henry VIII. So I knew religion was a huge thing. So I wanted to use that dramatically. So what I did was, I wanted there to be some kind of religious question with Fortunatus. So luckily, part of the research that I did, I decided to make him from Granada in Spain, and him to be expelled from there at 17 on a boat, and then arrived in England for him to be baptized at 17. And that kind of fitted, and me and Miranda have discussions about what Moors is, or blackamoors. I mean, in the proclamation it said that these blackamoors were infidels. So I kind of played on that infidel, meaning that because some of these Moriscos still practice their own religion while being in the country, in England, in secret, like the Catholics. So I wanted to link that together as well. So after a while, I decided I managed to build up a picture of this character that I didn't know anything about, but at least it mirrored what was around him and her, sorry, I haven't done this before. It's very nerve-wracking. I feel like a historian, but I'm not. Okay. But also what that did was that what I wanted to do was I wanted Fortunatus to be the emotional heart of the play. And I've been an actor and a writer for 30 years. Over 30. Oh my God, has it been that long? 30 years. And usually the plays that I've been in, and sometimes the plays that I've written and seen, the black characters aren't the emotional heart of the play. They don't move you. You don't identify with their struggle. It doesn't have to be a racist struggle, but you don't identify with their struggle enough for when you leave the theatre or to be moved by them and you know. Now, if someone's being racist to you, well, fair enough. But not that, but by something else. So by linking the father and son story together, at least I found something. And that's the heart, the emotional heart of the play, was Fortunatus' relationship with his son. In 2015, 2016, my producer, who he rejected the Moors of England when I pitched it to him. Kept on asking me, oh, you know that Moors thing, is that still around? And I said yes, and we pitched it again to Radio 3, and then about 9 months later, we managed to record it over the summer, and it was broadcast on Sunday. Did I say it was broadcast? Available for download?
Yeah. We're going to download it.
Is it? Yeah. www.
Like 26 more days.
Yeah, 26 more days. The most important thing, I think, for me about this play, because it has been a labour of love, I mean 6 years is quite a long time to stage one project, is that what it showed was relationships between black people, Moors, and white people before the transatlantic slave trade. And that's a really difficult concept for us, in a sense, to imagine. Take away the civil rights movement, take away Windrush, take away the New Crossfire, take away slavery. What were we like to each other? The hardest part, I suppose, for the actors was to imagine that there was no animosity, racial animosity between them. There might have been xenophobia and normal hatred, but there wasn't racism as it was defined post-slavery, during and post-slavery, whatever justification it was given. And that's quite a difficult concept. It's a learning concept because we think, okay, well, yeah, we were more equal then, maybe, than we are now. We haven't got the baggage of history. We haven't got the wars, the pain, the suffering. We've just got people. So, I'd just like to leave you with that, really. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on that. It's actually interesting because I didn't mention one of the very significant points in the development of the court play was this issue of, was there racism in that period? And it's really interesting that my first draft, I mentioned I had 2 drafts, my first draft did refer to the enslaved, I didn't actually talk much about the story that I concocted, but John Blank in my story had left the English court 1512 and then had been 20 years a travelling musician, as was the case for many really strongly skilled, highly skilled professional musicians. They were sought up and they'd go from court to court. So that's my John, the interim, who's been around the world, man of mystery, you know, I called him basically. I've always said, you know, John Blank, James Bond, Jason Bourne, they're all JB. So he's been this kind of musician stroke spy, because actually musicians were, it's not like the era of EasyJet, you didn't just travel in those days, you had to have some agency, and his musical skill was his passport. But it meant that he was one of the people who was actually going from space to space. So it's not a joke that he could conceivably, and probably was at least a messenger, and possibly a spy, who knows. There wasn't a spy system, Cromwell started it, the embryonic spy system that, what was his name? Walsingham created 50 odd years later, 40, 50 years later, was in its infancy, but Cromwell was thinking about network. So it's not inconceivable. Again, I'm taking it's poetic, dramatic license. But I, in my first draft, had John referring to racism because the Portuguese and the Spanish, even though the English hadn't gone in on the slavery game, were definitely into that game. Our country, Nigeria, the capital then, what subsequently became Lagos. If you Google Lagos, Portuguese spaces come up. So we talked about that. And then we thought, just as you concluded, this is an opportunity to actually look at not even just dynamics between white and black people, but just about black people, dynamics to do with black reality, which have nothing to do with this notion of race. So we took it out, and that was a significant point, and it was actually an education for me because I put it in because I'm always thinking in terms of that dynamic. Absolutely. It's so much part of our experience.
I mean, I had to go to the Shakespeare Concordance to find out when race was actually used. The first reference to it. It is actually used in a Shakespeare play. I can't remember which one. Someone died of vile race, it might be. But it might be The Tempest or something. But it is used, but I don't think it's used in the same way as we use it.
And I'm writing 60 years earlier than that. So there wasn't that conversation. You addressed this in your book quite interestingly, and Onyeka does. And again, for a writer, that was quite liberating, frankly. I could just write people.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, the references to Catalina as who had been the slave of Cataragan. That's only in the Spanish papers. I don't think I've come across it in any English.
And she
so
may,
like you say, it's a very specifically like located place. It's not in English.
yeah, and also she may have been enslaved, but there wasn't an assumption, or it wasn't slave and African are synonymous,
No.
because other people were enslaved.
Yes, yeah, other people, yes.
So that was
And in England in 1509, there are still serfs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So English
Yes.
people
Yeah.
are bonded
Yeah.
to the land of the local.
and bondsman, which is used in Shakespearean plays, is nothing to do with racial identity or being superficial in colour. So yeah, it was a liberating thing for a writer to go into a period where we weren't burdened. Because my Georgian piece is all about a woman who was a writer and who was enslaved. And that's been something I've been wrestling with, because I don't want to write a story about a woman just because she was enslaved. I want to write a story about somebody who's challenging that, freeing herself, which she actually did, become free. So yeah, thank you for reminding me about that.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. You can tell this is the afternoon slot. Good afternoon everyone. I'm quite sure I was in the mortuary or morgue or somewhere like that. Okay, so this session we're going to be looking at Windrush, 70 years on. We've got a really fantastic lineup of presenters covering different aspects of the Windrush story and journey. And I'll just briefly introduce all of them. We've got Peggy Warren and Joan Welsh. They'll be starting first, and they'll be talking about Caribbean women's stories around the NHS. We've got Claire's here. Is Claire here? Claire? Yeah, not worried. We've got Wendy Webster, who will be talking about the women's generation and the Second World War. And then we've got Beverly Cooper Chambers, who will be talking about Windrush in the context of film and television. As you know, this year is the 70th anniversary of the HMTV Empire Windrush that stopped in Tilbury. It's also the 70th anniversary of the NHS. It's also the anniversary of the 1968 Race Relations Act. It's also the anniversary of King Powell's rules on public speech. And there's lots of anniversaries this year, so it's quite apt and appropriate for this panel debate around the school. Can you hear me? Discovering Black British history. Notting Hill Carnival, Notting Hill riots. That's not ISIS. And so this is quite apt in terms of Black British history and the historiography of Windrush that we explore this today. Some of us in this room, and I want to acknowledge Arthur Tarleton from the Windrush Foundation, have been really kind of documenting the history of Windrush for many years through the Windrush Foundation. And many people here have been doing a lot of work around Windrush over the decades in terms of historical research, in terms of drama, etc. So it's quite important. And as you know, we had the Windrush scandal this year, which really exposed the vulnerability, not only of what happened around people from Caribbean and Africa being affected by the scandal, in terms of them being their status being questioned and their citizenship being questioned, but actually it was the first time ever, ironically, despite all our efforts of campaigning, of raising awareness of the history of Windrush, that the great British public understood the history of the ship, understanding the history of the generation and what that means, and its contribution. More people between the period of June this year, right up to about June, or when we came to the commemoration and 70th anniversary of Windrush, learned about the Windrush because of the scandal. Every single day there was news stories, oral histories, as well as the experiences of the victims of the Windrush scandal on TV, on radio, online and social media. And more people in Britain learned about Windrush in 2.5 months compared to the last 60 years, which is raised lots of issues about the national curriculum, raised lots of issues about the national constitution, how they have ignored or not valued that history, and it raises issues about what more that we need to do this research work and to cement this as part of British narrative. So please, we'll use this opportunity. We have our presenters, they will present their research work, but if you can think of, in terms of your questions, what more can be done? And I see Windrush differently. I see not as a Caribbean and African aspect, but also the journey itself is about migration. And as you know, the government has agreed to a National Windrush Day starting from June next year, which is initially going to focus around the Caribbean heritage, but obviously I think it should be much wider than that. But I think the key thing, what more do we need to do to cement this history of the women's generation. We all recognise that Windrush is only one chapter in Black British history. And what's interesting also, in our previous panel conversation about Tudor medieval period, there are some similarities. This proclamation, which never got enacted, you know, Royal Cut Forward, is like today's modern day proclamation around the scandal. So there's lots of kind of similarities around history as well. So I'd just like to invite Peggy Warren, who's an independent researcher, and Joan Welsh, who is a fellow researcher, working together on their contribution that's titled Engaging with My History Makes Me Feel to Be Me. Give a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, we've been really introduced. My name is Peggy Warren. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, do I need to speak up? Okay. So my name is Peggy Warren, and I'm an independent researcher. So I work in the NHS, and between us we've probably given about 3 decades to the NHS, and I teach within the NHS context. So I've been teaching women who are working at the lower tiers of the NHS structure, so they're working in the role of healthcare assistants. And my role was an amazing one where I was teaching women who were aspirational. So school didn't generally work for them necessarily, but they aspired to go on. And the government and the NHS has always had workforce transformation going. So I was working with a group of women who were impacted by workforce transformation. And when they were working, at the tier of nursing they were working, it was the lowest tier, and there was an opportunity for them to undertake an undergraduate programme and be lifted up professionally but also economically. Now, I taught all the women in my trust who were going to embark on this course, and what I found was that after about the first year of this 2-year undergraduate programme, the women started to say things like, oh, I'm not going to finish. So the first cohort kind of struggled through, but they started to come back to me, particularly with Black women. So what I found is that the Asian women generally had children who were at university. These were mature women in their 40s or upwards. They had some sort of social support, but the Black women generally were the first timers to go. So they would come to me, they had known me, I had taught them in a workplace setting, and they were basically saying to me, Peggy, we're not going to finish. And what came into my mind as a tutor was I complicit? Did I contribute in helping them to set them up to fail? And a lot of the things that they would say to me would make me think. So I'm going to use 2 angles here. I'm going to talk about healthcare assistants, but I'm also going to talk about in frame of nurses as well. So nurses who would go for interviews, and I would see them afterwards, would often come back and say to me, I didn't get the job, Peggy, but after all, I'm a good bedside nurse. And I wondered, where did that phrase come from? What were they meaning by that? And so it sent me on a little journey to have a look at what was going on. So I'm not talking about the Windrush people at the moment, I'm talking about the generation. So I think I need to make that clear up with some of what was said earlier by researchers. But on my journey back to try to make sense, I came across some research done by Snow and Jones, which actually helped me to kind of see why there was no Black representation of nurses in the senior tiers. And this was just one piece of research, but there was a lot of research that was there that actually supported. So the language used is quite stark. It says that the Black nurses were deemed to have limited intellectual capacities, and that would then negatively impact their motivation to complete training. And the words they used here are duped or forced into the lower tiers of nursing. And I saw that a lot, and I get that. I heard that story a lot, and actually I wanted to be a nurse myself, and even though I'd left school with lots more than 5 O-levels, I was encouraged to go into SEN. It's onto the SEN, which is the lower tier of nursing. And I've just got to say that I'm not a nurse. I'm just really curious about this field, and ended up embarking on a self-funded PhD. So what we do know is that the women who went on the SEN programme, which were predominantly black women at the time, they started to educate the next generation and to say, well, maybe that's something that you now need to understand, that the tiers and the tiers do cap you professionally. And so the self-education started. What I didn't understand though is what set this off. So actually what happened as part of my PhD was I went to Jamaica twice, and I went to the historical library there and spent quite a number of days in the historical library, and that's where I found out that actually what was happening in the training of black nurses in Jamaica was that they were taught the practicalities of nursing. So they were taught how to be good nurses practically, but sort of the science of nursing was omitted from the curriculum initially. And so that good bedside nurse label that the nurses were using, they probably didn't fully understand it, because to me it had a connotation that you can only be a good bedside nurse, okay, rather than you are a good bedside nurse, but you possess the capacity, skills and knowledge to do something more. So that was quite limiting. So the aims of my study really was to just explore what was, so let me go back. So this generation, so people like Joan, myself, I was a PhD student at the time, but people like Joan had been given this great opportunity to go on a course, to complete the course, and as they were going on this trajectory, what they were offered were a prospect of a new job, a new profession within nursing, and also some responsibility and some professional pride, because at that level where they're working, it's not very well accepted. Now my challenges were, I knew I was going to get a PhD out of this. By the time I started the PhD, there were about 3 cohorts who were promised the remuneration, and at the end of probably 6 years, not one of them had been successful in getting it. Okay, so they've been promised that you can be bumped up 2 tiers of the pay banding, and even those who successfully completed were not given any financial remuneration. And so women started to bow out of the course, which is understandable. And the trust that we were working for at the time would say things like, well, the black women are failing. And I just thought, well, that is way too simplistic, and I wanted to explore whether they were failing. Now I say the black women weren't failing, but the black women who opted out of the first year actually escaped being exploited. And that's quite a big say, but I definitely think that that's what happened. Now, one of the important things for me was that if I was going to contribute to history, I needed to learn from the history that we had. And why didn't we know that this is what good bedside nurses meant? Why didn't we know what happened to the SEN nurses? And I think it's because we often don't write about our lived experiences. So part of my dichotomy in writing was, if I write, will the women access it? So my challenge was to write something that would be more accessible. So I actually got the women's stories, and I had to retell their stories. But part of retelling their stories, I thought I need to do it in a way that they could actually get it, and they would access it. And so I actually wrote a drama. So I used my research data. I presented the women as fictional characters in fictional places, but I used their voices verbatim to get the word through. And so I think the drama has made the work much more accessible, but also what I wanted to do was to make it audio as well, so for people who just don't engage. And so what I'd like to do now, before I introduce Joan, is just to play you a small part of my dilemma, and the audio has got 8 parts to it, and the last part is my character, which is Zankofa, which means go back, learn from history and move forward. And that part of my character is just having a conversation, kind of just doing a bit of reflection with an ancestral spirit. So I'll just play a little part of this.
This complete work is an 8-scene ethno-drama.
Can everybody hear that reasonably well?
Of a group of black British and black Caribbean women,
tried it.
reliving their trajectories of higher education and work-based learning in the national pathway. Working in Britain for the dream of the Windrushes from the colonies.
Any better? I think I could have brought it
the lower tiers of the NHS for a prodigious 14 decades and 4 years. Their relived accounts in the themes cover getting in, moving on, getting through, then, penultimately, sending messages to their funders, their university, and their NHS trust. Fueled by her passion to make the work accessible, thus leading to activism, Sankofa captures the stories for a retelling at the end of the final metre. Sankofa arrives home exhausted but equally exhilarated. She puts away the bags and the books. She changes into her yard clothes, sets up the coffee machine and heads off to the patio. She plans an all-nighter as she wants to capture as much of the session's reflection as she can, whilst it is still fresh. She decides to take a short break first, so she lowers herself into the rocking chair. The garden is tranquil, the moon is full. Staring at the stars, she slowly drifts into a state of semi-consciousness. As she drifts, she dreams. A tiny, dark-skinned, white-haired character appears. She's pencil-thin, big eyes, and lovely white teeth. She's draped in crisp kente cloths and speaks with a quiet voice. She introduces herself as Akoko. She explains that she's an ancestral parent, and in fact, that is exactly what her name means. She informs Sankofa that she has come to help her with her reflections of this leg of the journey.
What has it all been about?
What, my child?
This whole journey. You know, my last decade. Life, power, exploitation, superiority, education, failure, inferiority, injustice, fear, silencing, subordination, life. What is it all about?
Tell me, my child, what have you found?
Where do I start? How do I share it? What I found is huge. Not all new in the larger scheme of things, but new to me. Your question is too big for me. What have I found? Well, I've revisited communication and strove to reclaim our oral history, whilst acknowledging that, because of navigating two cultures, that is not without challenge. I've written using an approach called autoethnography, and as Herman asserts, autoethnographies bridge the gap between the remembered past, the fleeting now, and the ethereal hereafter. I've relived the past, reviewed the present, and I am leaving an account of our lived experiences for the future.
I'm going to stop it there. So it just gives you, it's just to whet your appetite to see that I was trying to be creative to make research much more accessible. So, and hopefully then leave a legacy for history to come. And I'm going to actually just ask Joan now. Joan speaks a lot in using metaphors, and when I interviewed Joan, she actually told me so many stories that my brain just spanned for days afterwards, but I also giggled in totally inappropriate places, and this was one of the stories she told me, so I thought she's not going to tell it in a funny way today, but I thought it was a great way for us to end this bit just by her conveying how she felt.
For me, it was like a holiday, fully funded, an opportunity. For me, it was like an holiday, fully paid, an opportunity to develop professional development.
So I'm gonna ad-lib for Joan. So the whole opportunity of getting education as the first person in her generation, it just felt, if you equate it to a holiday, it's fully funded.
2-year experience at university. My bag was packed for me, no choice of university. Promise mentor, workplace mentor. Promise a new profession. New uniform, new bags. Overcoming the hurdle. Dyslexia. Not enough support. Accused of cheating. Appeal.
And I'm going to stop her just there. One of the fascinating things when I worked with Joan was that she was accused of cheating, and so she went through this process. And the outcome of the process were the content is yours, but the structure isn't. And if anybody in the room can make sense of that, then please come and talk to me afterwards.
No, non-payment of fee, bar from library, couldn't and need no assessment, and bar from university, landing in a ditch. Neither the university nor my workplace support me. Removed from course. Bailiff letter was sent to my house. Trapped without help. Turn up to university to present my last assignment, my last presentation, and I was stopped at the door because the trust did not pay my fee. They call me failure, but listen to my story. Who failed? I am leaving my story as part of my legacy.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And I used to work in the NHS, senior manager. I used to work on various boards. And I said at the very beginning that the 70th anniversary of Windrush is also the 70th anniversary of the NHS. And one of the things from my experience working at NHS is the level of discrimination affected by nurses. You probably saw a TV programme 2 years ago about Caribbean nurses saving the NHS. And you know, there were many powerful oral testimonies. And I know there's lots of oral history projects capturing the nursing profession. And I was at a recent board meeting, and I said that after 70 years at NHS, we should have at last 3 dozen directors of nursing of African Caribbean background. We've only got about 2 in the country, which is outrageous. Anyway, let's move on. My next presentation, that's going to be given. Claire's not here, so we'll move on to Wendy Webster. She's at the University of Huddersfield. The Windrush generation and the Second World War. And I think we're in treat for a film clip as well.
Yeah, I can find it. Here we go.
Do we need to have the mic?
How am I doing for time?
20 minutes, all right. I'm
20 minutes, okay.
Do you need to have the mic by the, or you don't need to?
Do I? Can everyone hear me all right?
No.
Oh, I see,
Can I
right.
just do what I
Okay, yeah.
Just in case. Okay, Wendy. And round of applause, please. You got that t-shirt, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's more Irish.
Okay, we're going to start off with a bit more. So I've got 20 minutes. I'm starting in Windrush Square.
Sorry, can I make a plea? Could we remove the microphone until we really need it if you're doing a video clip? So it's quite bad noise for the recording.
Right. Okay, everyone hear me all right?
Yeah.
I'm starting in Windrush Square where the memorial was unveiled last year to men and women of African descent who'd served in the First and Second World Wars. But Windrush is a word more commonly associated with post-war migration to Britain than with wartime. And of course we've heard this morning a lot about how the Windrush myth, that was the beginning of Black History in Britain, is a myth. I think the War Memorial in Windrush Square draws attention to the presence of the Windrush generation in Britain before the arrival of the ship, so they're called after the ship, but many of that generation, and indeed some people aboard the Windrush, were returning having served in Britain during the war. And others had stayed on in Britain. So in this paper I want to look a little bit at some of the wartime history of the Windrush generation, official policy on their recruitment to the services, and on what was going to happen when the war was over, which is particularly interesting, I think, and their memories of what happened when the war was over. First, some of the obstacles to men and women from the Caribbean serving in the armed forces. So this is partly sort of reflecting a little bit on the question of invitation that came up this morning. Originally, they certainly were not invited. A rule in operation at the beginning of the Second World War laid down that only men who are British subjects and of pure European descent are accepted for enlistment or commission in the RAF, and there were similar requirements in the British Army and Royal Navy. The RAF rule had actually been suspended during the First World War and was then reinstated. So in wartime, these rules tend to be suspended because people are needed, and so it was, particularly for men very quickly. But first of all, let's get a bit on the experience of when you see the application form, it asks completely baldly, are you of pure European descent? It's quite striking. Here's Dudley Thompson, who encountered this form and remembers his response. He was from Jamaica. I saw that one of the questions on the form was, are you of pure European descent? I wrote yes, because some of my friends had been turned down because they were not, and they were told so. There was a difficulty, particularly in the early stages of the war, getting in if you were coloured. I thought this was bad, really bad. This was stupid. This was prejudice, really wrong. So I said yes, because I wanted to fight. I wanted to fight against that. But the rule about enlistment was in the RAF was lifted in October 1939, so very rapidly. And George Padmore, the Trinidadian writer and journalist, was struck by this. He wrote an article for the official magazine of the National Association of the Advancement of Coloured People, which was titled Hitler Makes Britain Drop Colour Bar. And he wrote, it's one of the greatest ironies of history that thanks to the notorious race baiter Adolf Hitler, England, the greatest upholder of racial segregation among colonial powers, has been forced to discard the colour bar in the Royal Air Force in order to save herself. The arrival of the Empire Windrush actually focuses attention on men, as well as on post-war migration. And all the pictures of it that we've seen a lot of during the Windrush scandal, many of them are predominantly men, and just predominantly men who came. In wartime, the obstacles to women from the Caribbean serving in the forces delayed their entry until 1943, so much longer than men. As late as March 1943, the War Office were prepared to, quote, accept European women from the colonies for enrolment into the ATS, that's the women's branch of the army. But they emphasised that this applies to European women only, and we cannot agree to accept coloured women for service in this country. But later in 1943, under pressure from the Colonial Office, the War Office agreed that a limited number of black women from the Caribbean could be enlisted in the ATS. And I think that idea of a limited number, limited numbers only, is going to crop up again later. I know it is. This picture shows, it's not a very good picture, shows ATS recruits, including women from the Caribbean, waiting to be taken to a training camp in Britain in 1943. So they began arriving in 1943. And we can see some of them in West Indies Calling, which was sponsored by the Ministry of Information. So this is a government-sponsored wartime film. And it was modelled on a radio programme compared by Una Marson, who was the first black woman to make programmes on BBC. It's a great photo, I think, of Una Marson there. She made a lot of research effort to recruit men and women to come onto her programme who were in Britain, and wrote out to their commanding officers to request their release for a day. So it must have been quite nice to appear on her programme when she got a day off. And she also acted as compere in the film. Sorry, this is more slick, isn't it?
Let me tell you a bit more about how one or two of us spend our time. The Spitfire Fund was started in the West Indies, and attached to one of our own fighter squadrons, Sergeant Pilot Jimmy Hyde, who himself comes from Trinidad. He is reporting back from an operational flight. Hardly any of us had experience of flying before the war. The air routes between the islands were mainly run by the Americans. When peace comes, the increase in air transport should mean a new career for many of us who have now learned the job. Strictly speaking, Bermuda, British Honduras and British Guyana are not in the West Indies group, but they are the only other British territories in that part of the world, and from them too, many hundreds of people have volunteered to come over here. Lance Corporal Williams belongs to British Guiana, and she is in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. She retreads tiles in an army workshop. Here is a radio truck belonging to the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals. The two in the truck are the communication link between an outlying unit and its headquarters. Among these West Indians in the signals are some of the first Allied soldiers to set foot on the continent since the fall of France. They were in the Dieppe raid. These are some of the jobs we are doing. Together with others from the British Commonwealth nations, with men and women from the rest of the United Nations, West Indians are fighting for the new world that we all want to see. In Hyde's squadron, there are pilots from New Zealand, Poland, Britain and Canada. Friendships are being made between people who before the war knew little or nothing about each other, and we find it impossible to believe that these friendships will just fade out when the war is won. The Allied nations will get together to ensure the future peace of the world. But you know, and I know, that it's when we meet in a canteen or on a job. Then, for the first time, we try to understand each other, and real friendship begins.
So a lot of emphasis there on friendship, quite a lot of emphasis on women actually as well, which is very rare in wartime films of, you know, people who came from the Commonwealth to serve. They're mostly of men. Lots of different backgrounds then, people uniting across all these differences in a diverse nation pulling together. In fact, Jimmy Hyde, the pilot from Trinidad that you saw there, who's presented as part of that friendly group, felt a strong sense of isolation. He wrote in his diary, "I'm alone, no friend, no girl, no one in all England. The only time I feel at all happy is when I'm in my Spitfire alone in the clouds." And Hyde was killed in action in a dogfight over Holland in 1944. This film is part of a Colonial Office effort during the war to, quote, make a good impression, or create a good impression among the West Indians and many people of African descent throughout the colonial empire. This is what they were trying to do. These messages were very much propaganda. And West Indies Calling was titled Hello West Indies for its release in the Caribbean. But the message of the film was in stark contrast to privately expressed government views, which were about, you know, if Caribbeans are serving in war effort now, we don't want them settling in Britain when the war was over. In 1942, the War Cabinet noted, quote, the serious social consequences which might arise from the demobilisation in this country of any appreciable numbers of certain classes of coloured men who are serving in His Majesty's forces. But it also noted that those from British colonies couldn't be deported since they were British subjects with a right of settlement, and that overt discrimination in the form of a colour bar could not be accepted. In this context, covert discrimination was recommended, and I think, again, that's quite a strong theme in wartime government thinking. You don't do it openly, you do it covertly. So it said the only course open to us is to recommend very strongly that service departments should do all they possibly can by administrative action to reduce to a minimum the opportunities these men might have of being demobilised in this country. The concentration of these men in separate units, the restriction of their services to theatres of war, overseas, and the repatriation of men in complete units would do much to prevent a serious social problem arising. So I think there's a huge discrepancy between what the government record privately here and their public message in West Indies calling. The gulf could hardly be wider. The Ministry of Labour made similar recommendations on the future of West Indian technicians doing war work in Britain. So the government also recruited West Indies technicians as war workers. They're pictured on the cover of my new book published earlier this year. I think I might take a leaf after Rex's book and keep mentioning that. There are flyers outside for it. What the Ministry of Labour recommended when the war was over was very similar to what we've just heard about people in the services. It said, as they are British subjects, we cannot force them to return, but it would be undesirable to encourage them to remain in this country. We should therefore take immediate advantage of every expression in favour of repatriation, as the longer the men stay here, the less ready they will be to go. What happened when the war was over? Many memoirs by volunteers from the Caribbean make a distinction between wartime and post-war. Sam King was one of these. We mentioned quite a lot this morning. He served in the RAF, came back on the Empire Windrush. Somebody mentioned that, I think, and said that he found people more aggressive and saying you shouldn't be here when he got back. And there were riots against black communities in London in 1947 and in Liverpool in 1948. I haven't got time to go into all the many people who say this, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Gerald Beard, who joined the RAF in 1943, goes back to Jamaica when the war's over, subsequently returns to Britain, and remembers the contrast between wartime and post-war. He says, well, they actually turned on us after the war, saying, the war's over now, we don't want you. In the Air Force, we didn't come up against a lot of prejudice because we were secluded. We didn't have to go looking for a job. We didn't have to go and look for accommodation. But once you come out in civilian life, you had to come up against them. You had to find a job and a place to live and that sort of thing. We found a lot of prejudice. And Alan Wilmot records of his return. Alan Wilmot served in RAF Sea Rescue, and again he went back when the war was over and returned. I don't think he returned on the Empire Windrush, but he may have done. He said it was frightening because you feel you've been here before, so you should be more or less able to fit in. But being a civilian was a completely different thing from being in the services. The thing was what you come back here for. The war's over. What you come back here for. Why didn't you stay home? That was the attitude. For instance, you could go into a pub and the pub would go dead quiet as you walk in because you were a novelty then. Why you come back here? Some conclusions. Racism was very apparent in government policies on recruitment, as we've seen, and enlistment to the forces at the outset of war, and in planning for demob arrangements at the end of the war, or planning in wartime for what would happen when the war was over. But these policies were covert, not open, not openly acknowledged. The public face was the film West Indies Calling, with its very positive message about a Commonwealth of Nations. For many of the Windrush generation, I think it was in the post-war period and through popular and not official attitudes. You know, they don't necessarily know the government attitudes. These haven't been sort of openly expressed at all. But it's through popular attitudes that racism is experienced most sharply. In wartime, they'd been assigned the identity of allied, people who were wearing uniform. The uniform shows that they're fighting with or alongside the British. Those who stayed on, who returned after demob, you know, obviously have to take their uniform off. That's the whole point about demob. You give them a civilian suit, and you become, therefore, seen as an immigrant rather than as an ally who's fighting with us. Increasingly after 1945, despite the large numbers of white Europeans entering Britain, very large numbers, the notion of an immigrant and the idea of immigration was increasingly associated with a black or Asian person, and usually a male one. And finally, while I was thinking about this paper, I realised I've been writing about the Windrush generation quite a long time, on and off. So Imagining Home drew attention to the many women of the Windrush generation who migrated from the Caribbean independently in the 1950s. So it's a rather male image, but in fact there were very large numbers of women who came in the 50s and indeed in the late 1940s. And I just want to finish with something on that question about the invitation that came up this morning, the invitation to rebuild post-war Britain. That was the story that was told a great deal during the so-called Windrush scandal. I think the direction of British policy was clear. The plans to ensure that Caribbeans who had served in the war should not settle in Britain when the war was over were not reversed. So they're very clear in the government papers, and I don't think they were reversed. Government schemes for post-war labour shortages showed a strong preference for migrants from Europe. They were recruited in very large numbers. There was a severe labour shortage all over the place. People came from displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. They were recruited under bulk recruitment schemes from Italy. Continuing Irish migration was encouraged. Government concerns post-war, as in wartime, were to limit the numbers of migrants from the colonial empire. And that idea of limiting numbers comes up over and over again. And in the 1940s, there were secret committees set up by both the Labour government and the Conservative government to discuss ways of limiting Black and Asian migration from the colonies. So we've got the invitation story, which is about discontinuity. I think the invitation story, well, since we raised the question, I've just thought that is about sort of racism now, but not then when they were invited. Whereas I think the story about government policy in wartime and in post-war is really more one of continuity of racism and a limiting numbers story.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Round of applause, please. I've got to give a little break. So I want to invite next Beverly Chambers, who's going to talk about Windrush in terms of film and TV. And just to answer, I'm sure after time from the Bush Foundation, we'll probably comment a bit later about his work around research work around the Bush Foundation and the stories of veterans as well. So, Beverly, do you want to? Are you? And by the way, this Sunday at 1 o'clock in Windrush Square, there's going to be a memorial type service outside where the memorial is, done by Newton Jack, by Black Culture Archives at 1 o'clock. So there'll be a lane of wreaths, black poppies, red poppies as well. So if you're free on Sunday at 1 o'clock, Black Culture Archives.
In 1950 was a shock to two young strangers newly arrived from Jamaica. The bitter cold draft in the rented the harsh English winter of the 1950s. The harsh English winter of the 1950s.
Okay, hello everybody. Excuse my nerves, I'm just not used to doing this sort of thing. The previous picture you saw was a very popular one about the actual ship coming over Windrush. And I put that there because my mother and my father separately arrived during that time. And the biggest shock to them was the weather. and keeping warm. They were in tentative accommodation, and as my father said one night, he had to go through my mother's room to get to his room, and he didn't get that far. The result, maybe. I am a Windrush baby. After that, they went their separate ways, and they left me here, and I was left in a little village in South Marston, where I was at 10 weeks old, and I was fostered out to a lovely British couple. And that is the beginning of what we call fictive kin, in that you create a family with not necessarily your blood, but they're all that you have. But I, as a child, always wondered, well, where do I really come from? And so I'm now going to refer to Marcus Garvey, the great Jamaican national hero, who says a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. And it's very true, because you're always wondering, well, who am I? Where do I come from and why am I here? Also, we have the situation, family is so important. You know, we need to feel like we belong somewhere. And when you look at the definition of family in the dictionary, it says all descendants of a common ancestor. Fine. But if, as has happened to me on occasions, when they ask me to do a family tree, I can't go any further than my grandmother and grandfather, possibly. Whereas if my white counterpart can go way back into generations on both sides of the family. And so we really, as Caribbean people, and I am kind of focusing on the Caribbean people, need to know where we're coming from or what's happening. As I said, fictive kin is someone who, though unrelated through birth or marriage, has such a close emotional relationship with another that they may be considered part of the family. This goes all the way back to the time when our ancestors were taken from Africa, from Ghana, from Nigeria, and put on a boat. So they've left their family further. They put on a boat where they try to make relationships there. That lasts until maybe somebody dies, or you get to the Caribbean and then some people are left here, some people are left there, with no consideration as to us as people. And it goes right to when we arrive at the plantation, we're on the auction block. So every time we try to make a family and belong to somebody, it is destroyed and it's taken away from us. And on top of that, we have this thing called damnation memoriae, which is a modern Latin phrase meaning the condemnation of memory. That is, a person is excluded from the official account. All traces of their ancestors, their names are erased. So all of our ancestors who came over from Africa, their names are held, they can't have those anymore, and they have to then take on the owner's name, you know, which we use today, like I'm Cooper or I'm Chambers, you know, but I'm sure my ancestors were Cooper or Chambers. The bottom line is that they were property, required for the manufacturing of the Caribbean family for commodification in the slavery industry. So we were just part of an industry, nothing more, nothing less. The Windrush generation, when, as it has been named, you know, when our parents arrived and they came from the Caribbean, they came with a strong sense of family. And on television, because I'm focusing on television, you notice back in the 70s and 80s, we had the Fosters and No Problem. And probably the most famous one is Desmond, which has survived even to today. You know, where we saw the family structure and stable, albeit funny, Caribbean families. But then now, we've noticed a shift from functional families have now been replaced by dysfunctional families. And the Caribbean family network seems to have disappeared from the screen. So now we have programs like the baby mother and the baby father earlier on in the decade. We have films like Adulthood and Kidulthood. We have Chewing Gum. We have Top Boy, which was a major success. Major success. And one of the actors says that it got people work, it got them in the frame. So what's the problem? The problem is, what is it telling us about ourselves? So we have to go back to the television, the actual television itself. The television is a high-tech drug delivery system, as you can see. You know, watching television causes. Now I had to go and do some sort of technical research here because I'm not a doctor or anything, but apparently watching television causes a surge of natural opiates and endorphins, which are structurally identical to opium and to a derivative, morphine, codeine, heroin, i.e. drugs. So when we are sitting there watching EastEnders, Coronation Street, Top Boy, whatever, we are just being fed this drug and we're being taken, it's just going in there and it's closing down part of our brain which thinks and is active and just puts us in a really sort of passive state, and we're just taking this thing all in and we're starting to believe that this is what life really is. In fact, when I was here at Birkbeck studying, one of the things I was taught was imagine communities. And imagine communities is when life is really just getting you down here. All you have to do is turn on the TV and you can get Dynasty or Dallas or something and you become engrossed in that, albeit for an hour, but it makes you feel better. Mr. Marshall McLuhan back in 1967 said the medium is the message. What did he mean by that? He put it like this: for the content of the medium is like a juicy piece of meat carried by the burgers to distract the watchdog of the mind. The effect of the medium is made strong and intense just because it is given a medium as content. Simply put, if you have your house and you have a dog guarding it, and a burglar comes along and gives the dog a piece of steak, the dog eats the steak and forgets that he's supposed to be watching your house. The burglar can go in and do whatever he likes. The television, the content, what we watch, as I said, these things and what have you, that is distracting us away from the fact that the television itself, the screens and what have you, what it's doing to our minds. Who's doing all of this? Well, this goes way back from a gentleman called Theodor Adorno and a group of people at the Frankfurt School of Thought and a place that still exists now, the Tavistock Institute, where they engage in social engineering, which is the clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust. So we trust what's on television. And it has been said that television provided an ideal means to create an homogeneous culture, a mass culture through which popular opinion could be shaped and controlled, so that everyone in the country would think the same. So let's take Top Boy. We all think that black guys, they're all goodies, they're all into guns, and live on the estate, and take drugs, or sell drugs. And that's not the case. That is not the case at all. I want to say that when it comes onto television, we are black 24/7, 365 days a year. And when we want to watch television, which we pay our television rights for, we want to be able to watch programs that reflect positive, accurate representations of our history, our present time, and our future from our perspective. The first clip that came up said it's a new approach. And the new approach is this: we need a thriving black economy. We are going to establish a solid, stable black economy to support a British Caribbean television network, not a channel, but a network, starting and supported with a strong British Caribbean bank. We reject the crab in a barrel mentality. And that is that one over there, where it says if you can't have it, if you want it and I can't have it, then you can't have it. You know, and it's like, the theory is that crowds, when they go into a battle, they're always trying to pull each other down. We have to be like the other clip here, which is where you see other groups, white people, Latinos, the Asians, they work together and they help pull each other up. And as Caribbean people, we are tired of having that conversation. We say it all the time. We've got to stop saying it and do it. We're going to write our own curriculum for teaching television script writing and teaching in general. And we're going to train our media personnel in our culture, and we're going to present our history, our present and our future from a perspective which is ours, starting from now. This here is how it can be and how it will be. Basically, we have our own satellite, our own network, and our own money. Together, we can do this. Thank you.
So remember, you've been brainwashed. So I'm from Star Trek, so that probably explains who I am. Anyway, the final speaker, we've got, I'm not going to get your name right. This is Claire. Anyone? Super, yeah, great. And she's a filmmaker and director, and she's made a documentary, Windrush Stories Then and Now. Are you going to try and do the impossible?
I'm going to try and just show the trailer.
Yeah. Actually, out of interest, if anyone watches EastEnders, do you get happy?
No.
What's that? There's a general question there. Okay, fine. So remember, after this presentation, have your questions poised. Questions, not speeches. If you have to make a speech, I'll cut you off after 1 minute.
Alright, I'll talk for a short while.
I've got a beautiful assistant that can come along and help you. Michael?
That would be great, but what I'll do, I might just show some images. Post. I hope
The so-called Windrush babies are now in their 50s, and after a lifetime of work, many face uncertainty because they don't have the right papers.
Looks like the stuff going on, I'm scared of more painting out there than we are. Not angry, but frustrated of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm expecting, so I'm slightly tired. But thank you guys so much for coming. My name is Dr. Claire Anyamo-Sigwe. I'm a teacher, dermatologist and also a filmmaker. I really marvel what you were saying and giving some real wonderful factual information about how programming of who we are and our kind of community transcends onto the screen, which was my real driving force and litmus for making Windrush stories. I've got another film that's actually out right now which looks at the Black British experience. It's called No Shade. It's about colorism in the Black community. Because I think that, for me as a filmmaker, I guess my energy is coming from a Spike Lee kind of angle in the way that I think that we have so much work to do, and I know how powerful film and television are as mediums. And that was my first degree that I studied at Brunel 12 years ago. So when I'm up, me and my husband, we're the founders of the British Urban Film Festival and Off Originals, which is our production arm. When we was kind of invited or commissioned by the Voice newspaper to go out and document the celebration of Windrush at 70. This was a month before the news had kind of seriously broken about the scandal. We had no knowledge of it. My background is I'm Nigerian Igbo, so I'm kind of an honorary Jamaican at times because of I grew up in Care. My best friend is Guyanese, and I can see her mum-in-law there. And so by default, that's my heritage, is that as a teenager growing up in Islington, most of my kind of black experience was not Igbo Nigerian, it was indeed Jamaican and West Indian. You know, the cook in my children's home was from Jamaica, you know, we called her Auntie D. So it was, what was astounding for me growing up and then training as a teacher, as well as a filmmaker, was that I wasn't told, and I wasn't given in the syllabus for citizenship when it came to looking at how migration worked in the UK, how West Indians came to be here. I knew that as a Nigerian, my parents came here to lead the Biafran War. But I wasn't aware until I did my own level of research that the West Indian experiences that they were invited and that invitation had never really played a part in the way that we celebrated our West Indian counterparts within the educational system or in society in general. So I always felt that there was some sort of connection missing on the screen about who is documenting their experience visually, who is celebrating the massive contribution that these black people have made to our Great Britain. So when The Voice asked us to go out there and document it, and I thought it was fascinating because some of these people, the first person that spoke on the video, his name is John Richards. He came over on the Windrush boat, one of the first settlers in Britain, still here, 92 years young. And it was fascinating for me that the first time we went to do some of the filming, it was all celebratory and it was, a great praise. The second time we went there, obviously the news had broke about the scandal, and there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of trauma. One or two of their neighbours had passed away from the stress of not knowing where or how to fill in the paperwork. A few of them had travelled, came back home and were confronted at the airport, this humiliation of, have you got the right papers? What papers? We've always been British. This is supposedly the motherland, in that sense because of colonisation and the war and that contribution that they had made. So I think for me, I'd love to hear more from you guys, and I apologise for coming late. I was at another event this morning, but for me I think that the power is in storytelling and us doing what we can to document our own experience, because again I'm speaking, as I said, about really mostly me kind of honouring my friend who's Jamaican or Bajan Guyanese, but there were so many different islands that came. One of the women was saying that she grew up, playing doctors and nurses, and that she would watch the television, and it was like, please come to England, please come and help us, So then this sort of 70 years on, and it's like, we can't wait for you to go back. Thinking about what you were saying with regards to, it's always been a plan in a sense that there have been secret meetings with government about, we want you to come in, we want to use you basically, and then discard you once we have, used your manual labour, which is remnant of slavery. Isn't that what that was about? You know, you've got these displaced blacks living now in places like Brazil, where it's like, okay, you came over here as slaves and now off you go, oh, the favelas, okay, or in America, let's incarcerate everybody, you know, so you can't vote. So, you know, with Ava DuVernay's documentary, we've gone from slave to prisoner. So I think we're in a very tight situation here because, as you said, with regards to what we are allowed to watch on telly or what programs do get commissioned, if the figures don't lie, we will cry and say, why is there a Top Boy on telly? Why are these films making it into the cinema? But then when a person like myself puts out a documentary or a romantic drama celebrating and discussing the positive images of blackness, we're not getting behind those stories and going out and seeing them in droves. We're going on our own, on our ones and twos. We're not bringing the whole family, the grandchildren, their whole classmates, and investing in our art, in our entertainment, and then wondering why that filmmaker may never get a shot again, or we're not going to see that story again for another 10, 15, 20 years. And with the displacement of our young people, even if we look at some of the boys that were killed this weekend, West Indian, African young boys, filmmaking could be something that they could easily get into. Everybody's got a camera phone, which makes all of us documentarians at this point. So I think as a medium, we have the tools. We talk about talk, and you know, my whole thing is always action. And I think, if anything, we need to get behind what's already in place. I see so much of what Patrick posts every single day on the social medias, and I do wonder, I'm worried for you sometimes, in the sense of, you know, being on the front line by yourself most of the time, fighting that good fight for, you know, decades now. And how can we support those community leaders that have already been doing the work to make sure that that work is documented? Because without documentation, it's like, well, no one's doing anything. Oh my God, there's loads of people doing stuff, we're just not documenting it. So documentary filmmaking is something that I'm a massive advocate for. This is my first documentary, it's only 20 minutes. Could be sharper in places with regards to sound, but for me it's something that I'm definitely going to be encouraging as I go around and do more lecturing over in 2019, as I'm now a lecturer at Met Film School, but not just for private school kids, encouraging local community children to document their experiences, how they're feeling, what they're experiencing, what are their parents up to, because without it, it's, you know, we're not really sure who we are, and that sense of community seems to be so fragmented that we don't even know who to call on when it comes to that first step into wanting to know more about ourselves. So I think it's a great time for questions. Thank you again, Harmony, and apologies again for my slight voice.
Well, our final session today, for me, a most exciting session because it's about talking about black objects in front of you. We're walking around and looking at things and talking really exciting. We've got two panelists. First, we've got Lisa Williams from Edinburgh, who's written a brilliant walking guide to Edinburgh. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about this because some of the interesting things happening in black literature in Edinburgh. And then my good friend of mine, Tony Warner, to do a disclaimer. Tony and I work together, because I've got my image of the black in London galleries. It's one of the Black History Walks. Tony is the founder of Black History Walks in London. There's not a black object in London that you can't talk at least half an hour, 20 minutes. So I'd like Lisa to start.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Do I need to speak louder?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, yeah, I'll try. It's that end of day feeling, which I'm sure you all might be feeling at this point as well. So we're making it to the end of a wonderful marathon of the day. So, anybody here Scottish? Okay? Yay! Okay. Anyone lived in Scotland for a long time? Yeah? A little bit? Okay, so some of you are familiar with some of the Scottish concepts. So, I'm not Scottish, as you can hear. I've been living in Scotland for about 7 years. I run the Edinburgh Caribbean Association. My mum's from Grenada. I lived in Grenada for half my life. I lived there for about 20 years before moving to Edinburgh. My kids are still wondering why we're in Edinburgh. I arrived there from the beach into the depths of a very dark, cold Scottish winter, and I'm quite forgiving you for it. But part of the reason I started these walks and started my group was to get people together of Caribbean heritage living in Scotland who were very isolated. So I was meeting a friend from Jamaica that lived in Edinburgh for 20 years, and maybe me 2 other Caribbean people, and I was finding the same thing with people from other islands. So there's quite a few people who are first generation Caribbean immigrants into Scotland and now consider themselves Scottish, but living in a isolation. So this is why I began this group. So these walks started to develop out of the work that I was doing in this group, and it developed from the work of the programme Africa Emotional Film Festival. We had a programme about someone called Reviving Scotland Black History. This is something I've been thinking about for decades and researching and reading in my own time. I'm not a professional historian by any means, I'm an amateur historian, but like probably all of you, the more you read, the more interested you get, the more deeply we get into it. My children desperately want me to get out of my dressing gown now, get away from the computer and actually live a life outside history, because it has consumed me for the last little while. So anyway, I also started these tours because it's the first time it's been done in Edinburgh. It's been done in Glasgow for several years, and I went on a walk in Glasgow last summer, which was very, very impressive. And I was wondering why nobody had done it in Edinburgh before. There's some Scottish historians who've done a lot of work into the links between Caribbean and Scotland. Over the last 10 years, it's starting to come into the narrative a lot more, and some of them were quite concerned that it was too political to actually start these walks and get involved. So we'll see how this pans out. I think for a lot of people in Scotland, the idea that Scotland was involved in slavery in often disproportionate ways doesn't tie up with certain strands of the nationalist narrative. It's sometimes quite awkward fitting into that narrative. I've noticed in the last couple of years that people have started to talk about this more openly, being much less denial. It's creeping into the school system a lot more, and we'll talk about some of the school projects and school visits that we do as well in a moment. So, let's go to the next slide. So Scottish context, just to let you know that at the moment there's a lot of work towards a museum along the model of Liverpool's museum, so slavery, empire and colonialism. There's actually an online version of that at the moment, and there's a board that's been put together to create a concrete version of that in the next few years, looking at Glasgow for the location, possibly at the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow, which actually used to belong to a slave plantation on the wing of Cunningham, so we're kind of hoping that it's going to actually end up in that building. So most of you probably know, seen the newspaper reports about Glasgow University, looking into the links to slavery in Glasgow University. Edinburgh University is looking to do something similar at the moment, hopefully go even beyond what they're doing in Glasgow in terms of reparations. People are looking at that at the moment. And there's also been a graphic novel, so we had a lot of talk about the lack of school resources about some of these subjects. There's actually just been a graphic novel produced and distributed amongst secondary schools quite recently as well. Now, the good thing about the Scottish school system is that it's a little bit more flexible than the English school system, so teachers have a bit more power over what they can teach. And when we go into the schools, most of the teachers say, why don't we know this history? We should know this history. We weren't taught at school, we don't know anything about it, but actually we really want to know more about this as well. And it's the same with the children. The children are quite shocked when we explain some of the history. Black History Month has been going on in Scotland since 1987 as well. And interestingly too, in Scotland it's a little bit different because because amongst the ethnic minority community, Asian people tend to be more in the majority, so it's under the umbrella term of politically black. So it tends to be black and Asian stories that come together under Black History Month. So I'm just pointing it out that there's a little bit of a difference there. One of the big controversies at the moment, as there is worldwide, are what kinds of narratives we need to have on the problematic statues that are in our cities. So generally the consensus in Scotland is to not take down the statues, possibly move them to a different location, but generally is to expand the narrative on the plaques that are on the side of the monuments. And if you see the statue in the middle, there's a huge controversy at the moment about the Henry Dundas statue, which is where I actually start my walking tours. Henry Dundas, some of you might know, was nicknamed as the Great Tyrant of Scotland because of his immense power over decades. He was Lord Advocate, he was Lord Home Secretary, he was the War Secretary, and eventually impeached, which is a good thing because he was responsible, probably a lot of you know, responsible for delaying the abolition of slavery by at least 15 years. If he hadn't been impeached, possibly that could have gone on over a much greater period. And there's absolutely no mention of that on his plaque at all. And there was a council meeting done recently, actually interesting, with only 4 people, 2 people trying to keep the plaque exactly as it is, with no mention, and 2 people fighting very, very hard to make sure that is mentioned on the plaque. So we're waiting to see what decisions actually been made by the council about that at the moment. So also too, these walks have been dovetailing a little bit with the Freedom Trail that's been developed and piloted during Black History Month as well. There's about to be a Frederick Douglass plaque unveiled next week, hopefully. Frederick Douglass, probably most of you know, lived in Edinburgh for 2 years during 1845 to 1846 and did a huge amount of speaking tours at that point. So, main themes of the walks, and basically it's supposed to be an hour and a half walk, but it has been sort of ending up more of a 3-hour walk actually. Talk too much, there's too much to say. Most people don't want me to cut the information out, we're thinking about maybe cutting the walks and separating them out maybe into 2 different walks, because it is quite a trek as we go across the town. So we start in the city centre, and luckily Edinburgh is a fairly small place, so you can cover quite a lot of ground within that period of time. We do it on Sundays and Sunday afternoons. We piloted it for Black History Month, but we're looking for funding at the moment to train up a team, mostly with a couple of women I'm working with at the moment who are Black Scottish women or mixed race women, and to train up a team to see how we can roll this out over the year and also link it to our school project too. Now, a lot of Scottish people are quite shocked when they come on the tours because this is knowledge that they don't know anything about. Quite often people say to me, I probably knew 95% of this, and I'm absolutely in shock about how disproportionately how the Scottish were involved in slavery and slave plantation system in disproportionate ways. A little bit more hidden because there were ships leaving Scottish ports, but a lot of the business was done by Scots going down to Liverpool, going down to London, and it tended to have been, so it's a bit easier to keep that kind of knowledge hidden. There are more Campbells per head in Jamaica than there are in any other country outside of Scotland, just saying. And also, when we go into the schools and when I'm on the tours, we talk about some of the Scottish place names in Jamaica. So like Inverness and Glasgow, there's places in Edinburgh called Morningside and After Seeks, there's always places. So this really surprises the children when we go into the schools to see those kinds of links. One of the things I like to emphasise on the tours is resistance by African people on the continent, on the slave ships, on the slave plantations, and not to make it a whole story of white abolition. So that's one thing that I'm very, I make sure that is in the narrative as we're going through. We also stop at the Portrait Gallery as well. You'll see up in the top slide, the top picture in the middle there. We go into the National Portrait Gallery. Some of the curation, some of the institutions are really lacking. I have to call out the National Museum of Scotland because when you go into their exhibitions, it's very, very lacking. There's really no mention of slavery at all. You might see planter, it's very old-fashioned, you see planter next to a painting and it won't say where they got the money from or what they're involved in. National Portrait Gallery, we stopped there, they have a really good exhibition about imperialism, colonialism, empire and slavery. And their curation, which is done by younger people, is actually excellent. So we go in there and they have a first-hand account of David Dale, who was an enslaved person from Jamaica who was in Edinburgh. And that's one of the things I read from his account of his life when we're in the gallery. So I also tried to give an indication of where the money went to develop Scottish infrastructure. So railways, insurance, banks and so on. And also the New Town, which is a marvel of, I suppose you would call it Scottish architecture, which really just developed over a 50-year period. And when it first developed, around 1750, Scotland was the poorest nation in Europe. 50 years later, that area of Edinburgh was the most expensive piece of real estate in the whole of Europe. That's in 50 years. And that money's coming from Caribbean slave plantation. So that money, people didn't really think about where that money came from during that 50-year period. So that shocks a lot of people as well. I then talk about the 500-year, pretty much continuous presence of black people in Edinburgh. So we talk about people who came as enslaved people, we talk about people working as servants, we talk about political radicals. I like to talk about Robert Wedderburn, who had a Scottish father, for example. I like to talk about some of the black speakers that came, the freedom fighters, and also the university alumni, the huge list. There's a lot of work going on at Edinburgh University at the moment looking at black and Caribbean and Asian alumni over the last 200 years, which is really, really interesting. And a lot of the students are behind a lot of these decolonising projects that are going on within the university at the moment, with support from their professors. I also talk about John Edmonston, which is a lot of you will know, John Edmonston teaching Darwin taxonomy, and I actually end the talk there because I think that's a nice positive story to end on. We also have our equivalent of Windrush generation in Scotland, if you like. So some of you might know about the tree fellas that came from Belize. Does anyone know? Anyone know? Talk about that. Somebody will know about that one. Yeah. So that documentary was done, which is now about to expand into a full-length documentary about the 900 tree fellas who came from what was British Honduras, 1941 and 1942. Half of them stayed, half of them went back to, or some of them went down to England and went back home as well. But half of them stayed and integrated into Scottish society. And that's something that even Scottish people don't really know much about as well, but I think that's coming to the forefront much more. I also, at the end of the tour, talk about why it's so important for Scotland to come to terms with this part of the history. Because I think for Scottish people to have this idea, generally, I would say, it's progressive, it's liberal, it's a little bit more socially progressive than England, and this narrative doesn't always fit well. So I think it's an important time to really start to talk about this history and shed some light on it. There's a documentary just came out recently, I don't know if any of you saw, BBC Two Scotland, which is Scotland's Secret Shame, about Scotland and slavery. That just came out recently. And let's just see, go to the next one. We also include, I hope you can see this properly, I hope you can see the photos okay. But this is a musician that I work with from Jamaica, and I work with a few different arts providers from the Caribbean. And we go into schools during September and October, and we introduce the children to the shared heritage between Scotland and the Caribbean, mainly through music and through dance. He's amazing, does that amazing motivational speeches to get the children involved. And then with the older children, so in Scotland that's primary 5 and primary 6, which is like 10 to 12-year-olds, and then secondary school students, we'll sit down with them and talk to them about some of the more heavier subjects and the difficult subjects, talking about Scotland and slavery. Some of the children are really quite shocked and disturbed by this. Like I said, the teachers are really, really interested. They want to know much more about it, but they don't have the school resources. That's what comes up again and again. Where are our resources? If we had the resources, we would want to teach this. We would want to integrate this into the system as much as we can. Interestingly, we even went out into a very, very small village school in East Lothian, just outside of Edinburgh, and quite a few of the children there knew about Windrush, which I thought was good. They were only about 9 or 10 years old, and they were talking about slavery and talking about Windrush, and we hadn't said anything to them at all. So the message is starting to even get to those children, which is good. Having said that, sometimes we'll go into a secondary school right in the heart of Edinburgh, and we'll say, do you know where Jamaica is? Is it in Africa, miss? They don't know. They really don't know. So sometimes it really is working from ground zero in terms of information. So we also do community concerts for parents, so they get involved in finding out what the children have been involved in as well. And let's see, what's the next one? What I'm trying to do very much is create linkages with the local institutions. So what's good about Edinburgh, it's only 500,000 people. It's kind of like a big village. You walk around it. It is, I would say, it's quite segregated by race and class. But in the central part of Edinburgh, you tend to run into the same people again and again and again in terms of the people that are working within these arts institutions. So it's kind of a bit easier to get access sometimes to actually sit down and have meetings with some of these people in the institution. So for example, I've been lucky because people have been really interested. They've come on the tours, they've come from National Portrait Gallery, they've come from World Heritage. I'm going to do some tours for World Heritage, Edinburgh World Heritage members next summer. Historic Environment Scotland, Museum of Edinburgh, not the main museum, but the smaller museum in Edinburgh. And also getting a lot of interest from the university as well, perhaps supporting the school project too. So that's been really good. I've been really trying to make links across the board with the institutions as much as I can to start to really integrate this into all the institutions, especially the education system, and then also work with the education department in Edinburgh University, and then hopefully go into the Parliament and work with some people in the Parliament as well to see how we can quite quickly and strategically start to roll this out through the national curriculum. And like I said, I think we're luckier up there in that there is a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you can work with school curriculum. Maybe it's a little bit easier than in England. So I'm going to talk about some of my favourite people as we go through. I have a slightly personal connection. We just talked about Carriacou just now. Somebody who's got Carriacou heritage over there. And you probably know even more about it than I do. I lived in Carriacou for a few years. So some of you that don't know, Grenada is a three-island state. My mum's from the mainland. So we've got Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique. Carriacou is 6 miles by 2, those of you that don't know it. But it is of quite global significance in a lot of different ways. It's a very, very interesting island. Now, this lady here is Malvina Wells on the right, who this portrait was actually done in Carriacou before she left there as a young teenager and came to Edinburgh and worked with a Scottish family for probably about 70 years, about 71 years. She died when she was 84. And what's significant is she's actually buried with the family, with her gravestone, in the centre of Edinburgh, literally right off the high street. So her story is something that I'm really interested in trying to find a bit more about. You read about her in the census. She's shown to be living in quite a few different places in Edinburgh. She was living independently for quite a while, and then she went back to work for another family who was also connected with Carriacou. Carriacou is really interesting. For those of you who don't know much about it, it's one of the only places in the African diaspora where people can trace their ancestry back to certain peoples. So I have friends that say, I know I'm an Ashanti because my grandmother's Ashanti. I know I'm Igbo, or so on. So you've got Igbo, you've got Temne, you've got Cromanti, and so on. You know.
Zulu and Swahili, apparently.
Well, I don't know about that one.
Yeah,
but I know about this evidence,
yeah.
So there's about 7 or 8. And you have what you call nation dances, where people come in, like they have a ring dance, and people come in and then do their dance that's connected with their people, for example. So the African traditions there are very, very strong in music, in dance, and spirituality, which of course are all connected. It's a really, really interesting place. I met this ethnomusicologist once about 10, 20 years ago, who had done work over 30 years recording the ribbons in Carriacou and going all the way into inland Ghana and trying to match the ribbons and actually make those connections. So before DNA testing, we've got the connection through the music and through the dance, which I think is amazing. There was a reunion done held by the Temne people of Sierra Leone with the Temne people who identified Temne in Carriacou last year. And you can find that on YouTube. If you put in Temne reunion Carriacou, you'll see it. And it is a very emotional reunion to make that kind of connection across the diaspora after all these centuries and actually drum together, dance together, go through the music together, go back to the language and make that connection again. And there's lots and lots of reunions now planned, possibly for Ashanti people to go to Ghana, for Mandinka people to go to Gambia, and Senegal and so on, and create those connections again, which I think is really, really special. So that's something I do talk about. I try to always show the other side of what happened in Scotland, what happened in Edinburgh, but also what was going on at the other end of it. So for example, there's a statue of the Earl of Hoopton, who was the second in command to Sir Ralph Abercrombie, who helped to put down the Federal Rebellion in Grenada, for example. And sometimes I'm talking to people on the tours, they've never heard of the Haitian Revolution, never heard of Marcus Garvey, they've never heard of, certainly haven't heard of the Grenada Revolution. So, I mean, the Grenada, Grenada, you can call it the Grenada Revolution, but not the most modern one. So it's interesting when you go on the tours to always try to, like I said, join the dots throughout Edinburgh, but also join the dots between what's going on in Scotland and what was happening at the other end that you might not see so much. And it's actually Scottish people who, in a way, obviously responsible for the dislocation, but weirdly responsible for that connection as well. It's a really strange one because Oswald and Grant were a company based in Glasgow that owned Bunce Island, off Sierra Leone, infamous Bunce Island. They also had huge stake at Carriacou as well. So what would happen, you get 10 million people, for example, being held on Bunce Island for a long period of time, obviously horrific condition, but being able to keep a certain sense of identity because you're with people of your own culture, your own background, your own language. And those people moving together as a group to Carriacou because of that Scottish connection, because of that direct Glaswegian connection. And that in that way, able to keep, through all that trauma and all that horror, able to keep that connection. So Carriacou, I think, is really special for that. This is a story that I really like. Some of you might know about first black British school teacher, Thomas Jenkins. He was brought as a 14-year-old he was the son of a chief and sent to Scotland actually by his father to be educated in Scotland by a man called Captain James Swanson. Came to Liverpool, made up the way to Hawick, and I apologise to Scottish people because I can never pronounce this properly, but Hawick, yeah, Hawick, in the Scottish borders. And then Swanson died, so he was ended up destitute. This, I think, is just an amazing inspirational story. It's one I really love because he was actually working as a farm labourer for the Duke of Buccleuch. Buccleuch are basically the biggest landowners in Scotland, still are to this day. He taught himself English, Latin, Greek, and mathematics. Became a school teacher, was barred from the local school, but the Duke actually built a schoolhouse for him to operate out of. And then he went to Edinburgh University, studied theology, divinity, got his degree, and went to become a missionary in Mauritius, which I just think is an incredible story. Also, some of you might know about the Pan-Africanists that were living in Edinburgh. There's quite a lot of record about Pan-Africanists. For example, Celestine Edwards is proto-Pan-Africanist, who actually lived in Edinburgh first and was part of the temperance movement in the 1870s and came to Dominica. And then this is a lot of the work that's been coming out of Edinburgh University at the moment, the Decolonising Project. Uncover Ed, if you want to look at it on Twitter, it's Uncover Ed, and you'll see a lot of the research they've been doing into the Black alumni. I'm really interested in the Afro-West Indian Association of Edinburgh, who were Pan-Africanists. My grandfather was a Pan-Africanist, a follower of Garvey, so I'm kind of interested very much in that. Marcus Garvey himself, which I only just found out recently, visited Edinburgh in 1914. There's a letter actually written to his friend from a hotel in Glasgow. Interesting. Paul Robeson came, entertained the miners. There's a really nice videos on YouTube of him singing to the miners in the 1940s. But there is a whole list of speakers that came. For example, Ida B. Wells, who came on her anti-lynching tour, and actually Glasgow and Edinburgh were stops on speaking tours for a lot of black freedom fighters. So there's been a lot of research into that recently, partly with the whole exhibition of Frederick Douglass, which is actually happening in Edinburgh at the moment. So if you ever get a chance to come up to Edinburgh, come do my tour, go and check out the Frederick Douglass exhibition. It's the first time that all of this family archives are actually being shown anywhere in the world, not even in America. So it's come to Edinburgh for the very first time. And it's it's a wee exhibition, but it's very, very, very rich. And it's letters and photographs, and there's a lot of the freedom fighters that came, and black abolitionists that lived in Edinburgh during that period. Very, very interesting. I think almost that. So, going forwards, I have to say I'm very honoured. I'm going to be hosting a gala up in Edinburgh at the end of the month. I'm now working with Scottish Book Trust, and we're going to be doing an event for youth. We're going to be talking, doing some responses, creative responses to his excerpts from his new book, Natives, and also looking at some of the characters and some of the themes from the Black History tours as well. So we're getting 60 kids from different schools and maybe some universities as well to come in and start having a discussion about some of those things. I'm also looking at, like I said, trying to build the walking team to keep it going, looking for funding at the moment. And also expanding the school project throughout Scotland, because right now we're working in Inverness, we're working in Falkirk, we're working in Glasgow, we're working in Edinburgh, and it's growing and growing and growing exponentially every year. So we're going to probably end up with needing a much bigger team at this rate. And how we approach the schools as well, sometimes it's a personal link, sometimes we go through the parent council, sometimes we give them a little taster session, we're going and do an assembly. We've got Scottish principals that have never heard reggae in their life, dancing to dance up on the stage with the 12-year-olds, and the 12-year-olds just think it's the best thing ever. But it's also done with a serious intent, so it gets them interested. and then we start to talk about the history, and then we start to involve the teachers on a much more serious note. And the other thing too, I'm also trying to devise a youth-friendly version of these tools as well. Because often you get a lot of well-meaning moms like dragging their teenagers along in the rain, and their faces by the end of it is not pretty. I think I might put them up history for life. So I'm trying to develop some youth-friendly tours and exhibitions in the schools as well. So, also, this is the picture of the gallery I was talking about, which people generally are hoping that the council is going to give over to the museum. It will be a very fitting place for it. So that's going to be a hub, just like the one in Liverpool, for these studies of empire and colonialism and slavery that the schools can come and visit, which is very exciting. It looks like it is going to go ahead. And hopefully this will also start to bridge some of the divide between Scotland and England as well, and start to share the research a little bit more and understand what's going on in each place. So hopefully you will come up and see what it's like up in Scotland, those who've never been there. And because of course all the money flows and all the links between the families are all very interconnected, so we've got this sort of artificial divide, but of course it's one nation. So, thank you very much. I think I am finished.
Lots of questions.
Okay.
They can wait.
Can you all see that? Because you've got lights on the screen which messes up the image a little bit, but we can carry on with that. It doesn't matter much unless you can dim the lights. But welcome to my presentation. I'm going to talk briefly about Black History Walks. We organise walks, talks and films on London's African history every single month, all year long for the last 10 years, right? It's happened in 10 years. And it's not just walks, it's also talks and films as well, as you shall see. Alright, so here we go. So up here you've got some people on a walk in Notting Hill. That's a Notting Hill walk, right? Basically, take people around different parts of London and show them the African history, Caribbean history that's in the streets, in the buildings and architecture, because there's lots of it to see if you know what to look for. So that's Notting Hill up there. Down here you've got some people from Finland. They're from Finland on the St. Paul's Bank walk. So we have a walk that goes from the St. Paul's Bank area, because there's lots of history here too. And we find we get people from all over the world. So Finland, France, America, Switzerland, Germany come on these walks for the last 10 years in the 10 different parts of London we have walks in. There's a list of walks here. So Elephant Castle, we have walks in those different areas. And this is a reference to the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which has been mentioned today, I think, previously by another speaker. And they were American singers who came in from Queen Victoria, but they also performed in a place called Elephant Castle. Do you know where the shops there is? Yes or no? Do you know?
Yes.
Right. Yep. So opposite the shops there you got a place called the London Metropolitan Tabernacle. They performed in there back in the 1870s and sold the place out. So they performed in there in the 1870s, set up to sing to 3,000 people. But unless you come in the walk, you have no idea about that history at all. So we plan to catch people Black in their honor on that building sometime next year or the year after next. But that's a sample of some stuff we do. We show some more stuff we do. Alright, so of course you got your typical tourist attraction, St. Paul's Cathedral. That's why the water's called St. Paul's Bank, because it goes between St. Paul's and Bank. And we pull up all the Caribbean, African history that's literally in those areas, because I think that's one of our most popular walks. And people tell me they come on the walk because they don't think there could be any Black history there. So they want to be surprised and amazed, and they actually do tell me to be surprised and amazed, because even though the history is there, there's nothing to tell you the history is there unless you came on the walk. So we kind of uncover that in history. We also have some walks that go inside certain buildings. So we have walks which take place outside in the open air, and a couple of walks that take place inside buildings, like the National Gallery. And we don't actually work with them, we just do a walk in anyhow, because they're not really interested in art and history. And Michael, as I said, mentioned before, he kind of does that particular tour, and he takes people through the hidden, or the obvious sometimes, art history, Black art history in those exhibits there. This is an image from the Wallace collection, which is, anybody been to the Wallace collection? A few people? Well, there's a whole bunch of Black history there as well, but again, let's come on walks, you won't necessarily find it. So we have a walk in there too,
And then we have other stuff. So here's the thing that kind of freaked me out a little bit, because Condé Nast, right, is not really my typical target market. Condé Nast is kind of a luxury, high-end travel magazine, but for some reason they came on the walk and thought, oh, it's a really good walk, and put us in their top 15 what's in London. Apart from that, we've also been in The Guardian back in 2011 as being the top 10 best walks in London. And there's been some other kind of accolades as well. So BBC's come down, CNN's come down, filmed this over the last 10 years. And there is a level of kind of international awareness as to what we're doing right here in London. And these people who are in the Notting Hill Walk and this is the university, because what we find is that we're getting groups of like 25, 50 American university students coming from California, Florida, New York State, whatever, on these walks. They're booking 3-4 months of class to come and get a different view of London than they normally get from a regular London bus tours, whatever. So there's an interest from America in particular to access this history which is here. And up over here you got a coach load of people. So these guys are retired Americans, over 60s, traveling the world, going to Paris, France, etc. And when they come here, they want to get a different perspective on the usual history that they tend to get from the mainstream suppliers. So we'll be able to do that. So apart from doing the walks, we also have what we call our talks or lectures. Again, talking about interest and demand and need. You can see how many people are here, right? Look at the crowds. This is for our regular mainstream talks. We have them all year long, not just October. We do stuff on World War I, World War II, we do stuff on science and invention, and that's the kind of crowd that comes up. So that's for a free lecture. So you might say it's because it's free, that's popular, but no, that's not the case at all. It's because there's an interest in this kind of history. So if it's done properly, you can get 40 people in a room listening to Black history stuff. We also do kind of special events. So this is one we did like last week at the Fashion Retail Academy just near Oxford Street. It's about Neil Kenlock, that's in there, who was a photographer for the Black Panthers back in the 70s. He was also a photographer for a newspaper called the West Indian World. So this guy has about 3,000 pictures in his archive. So we had him come down, we went through some of his pictures, and he asked him a question about each picture. So that was very popular as well, that just took place last week. And we do that sort of stuff all year long too. Then you go. That's for young people. So this is one of his pictures. And this is a picture of some of the staff in West Indian World and some people they're going to interview. So we try to kind of bring this to life by actually having people who've been active back in the 70s, 80s, 60s to come and speak with their experiences to the next generation so they can understand and learn what happened in the past and how they can actually benefit from it. BASA. Now you might have heard about BASA because the point about this is that long before I was on the scene, people were doing a whole bunch of hard work to recognize this hidden Caribbean history. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't know how to justify the fact I know now. So there's a group called, or was a group called the Black and Asian Studies Association. They've been going for 27 years. So we organized kind of like a tribute session to them, like last week, Saturday it was, and we had some of the people who were in BASA come along and speak of their experiences. So we had Dr. Hakim Mahdi come down, Marika Shura came down, some other people came down, and we taught them about their experiences so we could understand how they got to do what they were doing back in the 90s, and how we can carry on their work to now. So some of the stuff we do is about having a legacy and paying tribute to people who went before us. So long before I was on the scene, people were doing this stuff, and I thought, let me do something to recognize that fact. James Brown fact. So this is one of Michael's lectures now, or Michael's in-house talks. It's titled Queen of Sheba, Black Saints and White Worshippers. It's looking at the image of the Queen of Sheba in European art going back a couple hundred years, as well as looking at the idea that you actually do have black saints who are worshipped right now by white people in Europe. So it's quite unusual, quite kind of different, and he's doing a talk on that. I think it's, 17th November, next Saturday. Week Saturday. So that's sort of stuff we do all year long, not just in October. We also try and kind of get into the youth market in that very popular film came out called Black Panther, you might have seen yourself. And we have a session titled Black Panther's Real African History and the Books to Prove It. It's a 2.5 hour long session. We go through the whole film, scene by scene, showing how in that film, Mr. Tudor, the director, has been referencing real African history going back thousands of years in some cases in the film. So some people watch the movie and thought it was just a movie, just kind of a science fiction stuff or fantasy. But we show people literally how this stuff is linked into real African history, and that's been very popular so far. The next one's taking place in Wardour Street, around the corner, and that's in the year 18th. We get a lot of young people for that stuff. This links into this building, and also what was said before about the lack of representation. So it's a fact that of the, you can read this obviously, there's a horrible lack of portrayal, representation of black women when it comes to academia. So we got together and said, what can we do to kind of address or rectify the situation? So we thought we'd use our platform to open up to black female academics and give them a room or a space to speak with their expertise. So we do lectures called the Queen and Zeng Lecture Series, like you're seeing here. And we get over a venue, normally it's a 150, 200 seat venue, and we bring in a different woman who's of African Caribbean extraction and has either a PhD or a master's or is just an expert in a particular area. And we set them up in a room, we bring a whole bunch of people to hear them speak, and they speak about whatever they want to talk about. So that's just one of our things in lectures. Again, you can see massive turn up, you can't even stand up in this room, and there's that level of interest in history, which is that's not served by the mainstream, including this place right here. One of our lectures was this one, which takes into what some sisters were saying on the panel just now, in that how often do you see this kind of imagery on your TV, newspaper, magazines, movie screens, whatever? How often? If you don't see it, how does it affect you? So we had a lecture all about that, because there's a massive need for a better portrayal too. This was a monster too, in that you can see again the audience there, packed out. It's about fibroids, links into the NHS. Been around for 72 years or 70 years, whatever it is, but there's a lack of kind of information when it comes to fibroids, which disproportionately affects black men. So we did a lecture on it, and that's the kind of audience we got. We do them all year long, not just as a one-off. Now, if you look at that there, that's just a list of some of the lectures we've done on the Queen Singer band. So we've done about 40 so far. This is just some of them. And you can see there might be one or two of interest to you from this particular list here, but we cover a whole bunch of subjects from ancient Africa to fibroids to mobile phones to resistance leaders. That's what we do all year long. And that's where we get this big audience from that's underserved by the mainstream. And what's interesting is, talking about institutions, like, you know, these lectures have been done for like 6 years. And in the 6 years I've been doing them, I've never had any kind of institution come to me and say, Tom, we'd like to sponsor you, we'd like to give you a room once a month for the next year or so. Never once. It's always been us organizing the venues. So even when there's this kind of diversity drive from mainstream universities, and we need to have more black lecturers, more black students, etc. Even though we're doing this on a kind of shoestring basis, we've never been approached to actually work with an organization to actually bring in an audience that they say they want to have in there, which is interesting. Now this is the BFI Southend, which is a huge cinema, not far from Waterloo Station. You can see, full of people. Now these people are paid this time, that's me up in the corner there. So listen to me say something about some people, never. But they're paid, because we have a program with the BFI whereby we show films on African history once a month, all year long for the last 10 years as well. We show films with this kind of cast, right? And it's called the African Odysseys Program. So that is roughly £6.50 normally, sometimes it's £10, but it's cheaper than your regular cinema trip. You see films there you will never see anyplace else. The films we show from Cuba, Venezuela, Barbados, the Caribbean, America, films that are high quality films, often about history, but let's look at it afterwards, right? And the films we show for our program are not shown in any other cinema in the entire country. That's just the fact. For some reason, that's the situation. So it's quite a unique program. It's quite rare as well. It's the only cinema country that actually do this, and we have, again, a fairly good following for the stuff that we do down there. So there's a typical audience. And this is what we've been showing, which links back into what Sis was saying about documentaries. Because if you go to school here, you talk about civil rights in America, you always hear about American civil rights, but what about what happened here? This is a picture of the Black People's Day of Action 1981. So in England, we have people marching for civil rights right here in the 80s, But this entire story is not part of our curriculum. But you will learn about Luther King and his March on Washington 63. So we had a whole day looking at films that were made by people who lived here, documenting our experience in this country right here. We showed films like this, Can't Be Very, which gets into World War II in that we know for a fact that the guys who fought Britain in World War II were not treated fairly when they came back here to help Britain after the war was over. What happened in France? The same sort of thing. These guys fought for their country, for their mother country, so to speak. Once the war was over, they had a problem getting paid equally, and then for some of them, they actually got shot for complaining about that lack of representation, that lack of respect, etc. So you find out when you look at history from around the world. This is all about deaths in custody, a topic which you're probably too familiar with. But again, this film here was literally banned. People didn't want to show this film at all. So again, we showed the film, but also brought in some of the family members and the directors, producers to actually discuss their expertise and raising the rest of the film. But again, this is something that doesn't happen all that often when it comes to your mainstream cinema. To see it, true story, well, based on a true story of the Asian Revolution, which people in Scotland don't know about. Well, not just people, other people down here have never heard about this. So this film here packed out BFI 2 occasions, then packed out the Phoenix Cinema 2 occasions. So there again is a huge interest, but there's a lack of representation, a lack of kind of opportunities to be shown. And I can say for a fact that even though we've had films that have been making money in cinemas, that we've put films in, there's been cinemas, even though they're making money from the films, did not want to show the films again. So I've actually got 10 years of business, so I can tell you for a fact, even when the cinema's making money from a film, they do not always want to show that film, even when they're making money from it, for some odd reason, which we discussed later on possibly. Back to art, or British art and drama. So this is, well, you can see what it says there. A very interesting play which was filmed about how apartheid was reversed in the UK. And you had blacks at the top and whites at the bottom. This was properly banned and has hardly been seen since it came out in '65. So that's the sort of films that we show using our resources, our networks, and our grassroots activism. And when's the last time we seen a movie about a black living couple from Curacao, which is out there in the Caribbean, not far from Aruba, etc. Remember, needs no words to explain that. So apart from the walks and the films, we've got courses now. I don't know if you can read that. It says, The Amazing James Baldwin, a 6-week course, African Women Resistance Leaders, a 12-week course, and 10 years of African Odysseys, Black Films, White Power. And that's another 10-week course as well. So we put on courses to complement knowledge, because people come to the walks and say, I want to get more information. So when they go, they either go to a film or to a 10 or 12-week course. Because there's an increased demand because people are exposed to history which they've never heard of before. So we do courses too, all over London, north, south, and west. And this is one of them. Now if you look here, you might have heard about a group called the Mangrove Line, Black Power movement, or Black Power activists back in the 70s, who had tried the Old Bailey, and they were called the Mangrove Line. Now down here you've got Alfie Jones DeConte, there's Barbara Beast. These are all women who actually defended themselves in court against QCs without any formal legal training. So they had no legal training properly, but they're actually up against QCs in this country back in the 70s. They actually won their case. But this course is all about black women who fought back against the system, be they in Brazil, or Canada, or England, and we go through that history in those 12-week sessions. And this is what we've been doing.
We've complained to the police about the police and nothing's been done. We've complained to magistrates about magistrates and nothing's been done. We've complained to judges about judges and nothing's been done. Now it's time to do something ourselves. That statement was made at the Mangrove demonstration and represents the essence of black people's experience in Britain. That since we've come here, we've suffered a long train of abuses by the police with the active knowledge and support of the British state. And those abuses have been able to be carried out under the pretext that, quote, black people are criminals, sponsors, and prostitutes. That is a myth that has been created about us. That is a statement that was made by one police officer who gave evidence in the Mangrove case. Now, the demonstration that black people made against the harassment of the Mangrove restaurant, the subsequent resistance in the courts,
is an active explosion of that myth.
So that was Alfred Jones LeConte. She was one of the leaders of the Black Panthers based in this country. She was also, at the time of her defense in court, pregnant, and she was leading her own defense against these, qualified QCs, etc. And she still won, and she won a case. So she's an amazing character. And this is one of the training sessions which took place in her home. So we contacted her, got in touch with her. She was impressed with what we did. She actually invited us to her home, and we had one of the sessions, the last session at her home, and they're all feeding back on what they learned on the sessions. And then in the middle here, you can see that's Alfred Jones LeConte. So what we're doing is we're trying to bring this history to life, because often the people are dead, but these people are still alive. So why not have them come and tell us what the history is all about? So we can learn from them firsthand. They can actually tell us what they did and how they did it, etc. And inspire the next generation. That's what's happening here. Now this book here is all about Black Brits and rights. It's written by 3 Black women. Beverly Bryan, Stella Datsey, and Susan Scaife. They wrote this book in the 80s. It's all about Black women experiences in this country when it comes to equal rights, etc. And on the same course I just mentioned, we had this lady here, who is Beverly, right? So we had her come down and speak to the people on the course about what she was doing back in the 70s to fight for equal rights for women. Back to the American-UK comparison. We all know who this guy is. And this guy, his name is Dr. Harold Moody, but if you ask the average person in the street, who is this guy, they'll tell you, I've never heard about him. But they know about him. The thing is that this guy here was a doctor, a preacher, and a civil rights leader in this country in 1931, and had a group called the League of Colored Peoples. So he was doing the same thing Luther King was doing here in the 30s, but Luther King was from us in 1955. So how is it we know all about Luther King? How is it coming to actually in our curriculum in schools? You don't know about him in schools, but people have never heard about this guy even by way of comparison. So he actually features, Dr. Moody features on our Soho walk, which takes place through this building. So one of the walks we have starts at Russell Square, comes through here, this building, ends up near Oxford Street. And we feature him on this walk because he used to have his meetings in this place. Let me show you where it is. Who can tell me where is this venue? Where is this road? Anybody know? Because thank you. If you came to this venue, you probably came through that tube station. This is Tottenham Court Road right here. Tottenham Court tube station is right this here. And if you come to this road, this is called Great Russell Street, right next to the Barbados High Commission. And Mr. Moody used to have his meetings in the YMCA, which is right there. Alright. First meeting was March the 13th, 1931, where you had the League of Colored Peoples, which are fighting for equal rights, justice, etc., right here in Britain, in London. And that's where he had his first meeting. And next year will be 88 years since he had his first meeting. So we want to recognize that fact, and that is where we want to put a plaque in his honor. And to do that, we're going to do this. Got 2 big events coming up next year. A Black History River Cruise, which will cruise from Vauxhall to the Thames Barrier and back. And on the way, we'll have a narrated history of all the African Caribbean influences on the east side of the river. So if you're a Black History cruise driving down the river, sail down the river, and on top of that, linking into what Mr. Lange was saying, and something else to say as well. Phyllis Wheatley, you know what Phyllis Wheatley? And there's also a lady called Mary Prince, which I'll get back to later on. But basically, on the boat cruise, 3 hours, we're going to have 2 people, 2 women, who have a PhD and a Master's in English Literature. They'll be playing Phyllis Wheatley and playing Mary Prince. So between now and next year, their job is to research all you need to know about Mary Prince and Phyllis Wheatley. And they'll be dressed in period costume on the boat as it goes up and down the river. Right? So that will be another part of the learning experience, that people can take pictures of them and hear their stories. And then when we raise, we'll be going to put a plaque to Harold Moody, as well as a Black History. Oh, hang on. The reason I put this map up here is because we are here, right? That's where we are. Are we? Yeah. Now, see this baby? That baby is on Mallet Street, and on Mallet Street there's a plaque in honor of Mary Prince. So as you come to the building, turn left, and then turn left again. The plaque for Mary Prince is right here. So Mary Prince is here. She has a plaque already. And then Great Russell Street is about here. So we'll have a plaque to Mary Prince, that's there already. But we'll have a plaque to Harold Moody. But on the boat and on the bus tour, we're going to have those characters, Mary Prince, Phyllis Wheatley, on those trips. Then we have a bus tour, 3-hour-long bus tour, Black History bus tour. They'll drive around London, doing the same sort of thing in that for each tourist stop we come to, be it Big Ben or Buckingham Palace or it is, or Oxford Street, we'll speak about the Black history in that area and put it onto the kind of the tour of the bus. And on the bus, of course, we'll also have Mary Prince, Phyllis Wheatley in costume, answer questions about their life and history on the bus tour. So it'll be a very inclusive, immersive experience, including a bit of theatre as well. But we're also raising funds for 2 other blacks. This guy here is David Olusoga, and he actually put up a plaque on Tom Cribb's pub, which is not far from Leicester Square. And Tom Cribb's, one of his most famous fights was against a guy called Bill Richmond. So Bill Richmond was a black boxer in the 1800s, as was Tom Molyneux. So you had 2 black boxers in the 1800s. And they would both hang out at Tom Cribb, the white guy's pub. But we know, more or less, where Bill Richmond's pub was, because Bill Richmond also had his own pub. So we kind of worked out where it is. We're raising funds to put a plaque in his honor. When we put a plaque in his honor, we'll also honor Tom Molyneux because they both worked together. So Tom Cribb had a fight with Bill Richmond had a fight with Tom Cribb. He lost the fight. So then he then recruited Tom Molyneux to then fight Tom Cribb and have another fight with. So there's a massive amount of history there. I'm going to put plaques of both those guys at the address we have identified, which is not far from Trafalgar Square. Now Baron Baker is the third person to put a plaque to. Now, you know about Harold Moody, you know about Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux. You might not know about Baron Baker. If not, let's watch this, because Baron Baker is a real legend. Sorry. Try again.
He was deeply affected by what was happening. Very fearful. Very insecure. Nobody wanted us. Still less. Nobody liked us. What the hell were we doing here in this situation when we were given to believe that we were coming here, in fact, to a home away from home? With the white mob out to menace them and the lack of protection from the police, the black community decided enough was enough. A meeting was convened in Tony Bag's Blues Club at number 9 Glenham Crescent.
During the day we made preparations for the attack. And I can quite clearly remember that I was standing on the second floor with the lights out in 11%. When I saw, look out and see from Kensington Park Road to Portobello Road, with a massive lot of people out there. And I distinctly hear when they say, let's burn the niggers, let's lynch the niggers. And from those spoken words, I said, start bombing them. And then you see the Molotov cocktail bombs coming out from number 9%. Then they say, oh, they are bombing us too. I said, open the gate and throw them back where they are coming from. And they will come from Latimore Road area and things. Then when the police saw the amount of people that was in number 9, they drove the Black Maria and rammed the gates and said, not another one of you black bastards coming out. And I was arrested immediately. But from then on, the rest of my colleagues took over.
So that links into both Windrush and the fact that it's been, 60 years since 1958, I think it is. So there's an anniversary of these riots, which should have taken place this year. It wasn't that well recognized at all, which is why we think we put a plaque in his honor. Because Baron Baker was an ex-RAF veteran, and when he lived in Nottingham in the 50s, it was a scene of constant racial attacks. Guys were driving in cars, white guys driving in cars to attack the black community, beat up men, beat women, and then go back out. So Baron Baker said no, he's not going to have that. He actually organized a self-defense group based in number 9 Glenham Crescent, which is at that time a blues club called Tudor Blues Club. And he was attacked himself by a group of, as you heard there, three white guys outside there saying, let's kill the black, let's lynch the black people. And he had prepared these petrol bombs, so when they came, he just flung them at them and they ran away. But they ran away and told the police on him, so the police came and arrested him for defending themselves. But the rest of the guys being trained in military operation for, okay, we know what to do, our leader's gone, but we're going to carry on the fight in that area to defend the people, right? So that's what happened, and that's what we're going to put back towards him, because I'm pretty sure English Aristocracy is that kind of story. But that's it. Okay.
We decided we're going to do this wrap-up session a little different, because people always complain and never get time to make their points. You know, so now is the time for you to make the point. But we're going to give you some direction here. We're going to give you some time to think about it. Not going to tell you what to think. But one of the things we think is important about today is that you don't just listen, you act, you do things. There's takeaways. So what I want you to think about, and the panelists will be thinking about, what are your takeaways? What are the three things? The three things you're going to take away from today. And that first one, let me challenge even more, some action. You're going to do something with it. You're going to do something with it. So, which of our panelists would like to go first? And to make it really interesting, with these, I want this documented now. This is where you get to see how committed you are. I need a secretary, someone who's going to take notes. Anyone, any hands going up to so paper, you're going to take notes, yeah?
Where? Here?
Yeah. You've got a piece of paper and you're going to write it, yeah? So what you're going to write is the name of the person and ideally 3, you know, minimum 1. And you're going to do something, yeah? So who would like to start? Now, the panel give you time to think about it. The first action, your three things, your takeaways. What's your takeaway you're going to do something with?
Like, we're going to do something.
You're going to do some person.
Well, I can do one. So I work for the Dictionary of National Biography, so I commission lives on history. I'm here because I'm working with Miranda a bit we've got a forthcoming release of some. But the first thing I'm going to do, my action, is I'm going to go through a list of names that came up today that I didn't really know. I'm going to check that they're in the dictionary, and if they're not, then I'm going to look at putting them in the dictionary. So that's like my first point. So the other 2 thoughts that stood out from today, for me, one thought, I mean, I'm an academic and a scholar, and one thought that really stood out for me today was that actually with a lot of history, and I think it stands out particularly with Black British history, that it's one thing to write detailed scholarship, it's one thing to try and tie down the information, it's one thing to do that hard research and present to those kind of audiences. It's another thing to try and take that to a wider public, and that's a really, really important and critical task, right? So that task of taking it to the public is my second point. And the third point would be that, and I think that this is something that doesn't just apply to Black British history, but that applies to history in general. I see it in a lot of fields that I'm involved in, is that when things become public, when they're public facing, especially when we start to look through things like, there's been a lot of talk about commemorations and anniversaries, there's been a lot of talk about the Windrush generation, that term's now very solid it seems. That often when you get that kind of public discussion, what is sometimes lost in that kind of like public-facing public history is that like the complexity of the contexts and the nuances and the difficulties that come up. And we had a discussion several times today about Windrush and about elements of the public discussion of Windrush that people are uncomfortable with in some sense and don't feel reflect like the complexity or do justice to the context, right? So that's my third point, is that like tension between the task of wanting to do public history and like the difficulty in judging doing public history right, I guess. Yeah?
Okay, brief.
Sorry.
So, I mean, it's some of the things I'm kind of doing already, which is kind of, like keep on doing what you're doing. So, as you know, I spend a lot of time on social media. If you don't know that already, for those who are in the social media space. So I launched a petition about 10 days ago. As you know, the Bank of England, they are looking for a new face on the £50 note. It would be a brand new type of, using the polymer fabric for £50 note. And so I did a petition and changed the law that Mary Seacole should be the new face of the £50 note. And over 130,000 people signed my petition in the last 2 weeks, which is good. But then the Bank of England decided last week Friday that they are now looking for a scientist to be on the £50 note. So if you know your history, I mean the way that the criteria they'll use is it's going to exclude virtually lots of women and lots of people of colour because the criteria they will use by having that narrow definition of. So I've teamed up with a young Muslim woman called Zahia, because she launched a petition at the same time I did my petition about promoting Muslim women to be on £50 note. So we've teamed together, we launched a new petition a few days ago, and we're calling out the Bank of England to say there should be a person of colour on the new £50 note. Because otherwise, this is about the whole, and this is the theme throughout today's event, it's about the visibility of our history and how that history influences the public and the media and the schools, etc. Just imagine next year a £50 note with someone like Mary Seacole or a woman of colour on the £50 note. That would have more impact. I'm not trying to say in terms of all of our work around campaigning and literature and research and drama, but that will have another impact on everyone. So my takeaway is for you to get involved in my campaign. And also what I'm looking for is that for those people who have a passion in science and writing, making a case why people of colour should be considered, so you can do a submission directly to the Bank of England. I think that's important. The second thing is to do with Windrush, keep it very quickly. You know, I'm still involved with the whole stuff around the scandal. You know, the government are doing the compensation scheme quite dedicated to, which I couldn't attend last week, on the whole issue. And it's still ongoing, but what's quite clear and what's quite apparent, and some of us, all of us in this room, none of us have been campaigning around national curriculum for donkey's years, is that we still need to have Windrush in the national curriculum. So the question is, how are we going to do that? I mean, it's not so about me, it's about how we're going to make sure that Windrush is national curriculum. I recognise that Windrush is only one chapter in Black British history. That's another question mark. And the third one is really about activism. How do you combine activism with combine that with creativity, with some film, drama, theatre, in terms of how engage not only our communities I should say, but the public as well. How do we use it, like Michael was saying, be creative? How do we use the art of creativity to make history passionate? Not make it an arid, dry, boring subject. You have to, you know, how do we make it exciting and engaging to influence people? So that's what I'm trying to do. I've done it through films, books, social media, blogging. But actually, how can we do it collectively to create this impact? That's all I'm saying.
Okay. But Rand, I'm going to make your life easier because time's not up. Because the hour's been by 5:30. So forget the three. I just want the one action there. Just the one action. I'll make it easier for all of you. So your one action you're going to do tomorrow morning. Bang.
Well, what I'm doing tomorrow morning isn't one of the things on my list, but it's kind of related. No, that's not helpful.
What wants to come back to you?
No, okay, so there's one thing that I'm already involved in that I'm pursuing that draws together quite a lot of the things that have come up today, and it's the Colonial Countryside project. We're working with the National Trust. There are 10 National Trust properties nationwide, and each property would link with a local school, so there's going to be a class of 10-year-olds from the local school, and each property has had a creative writer assigned to them, and they're exploring colonial connections to that property, connections to the Caribbean, but also connections to India through the East India Company, and the children and the creative writers are exploring those histories and writing inspired by those histories. And it's a 3-year project, and in the 3rd year, 4 books are going to be published based around those writings. and there's going to be lots of public events in the National Trust properties, there's going to be exhibitions. So that kind of brings in teaching these histories to children, engaging their whole families through the children, having creative responses to the history, but also sharing that history very publicly with a large public audience of the National Trust membership, which is huge. Is that enough?
You just give a pitch for your project. So
You told me about action.
Okay, let's go pitch. What's a pitch? Okay, we'll give that. Okay, the floor is yours now. Who's going to give us their takeaway? All gone quiet. Now remember, people complain what is.
Well, it's not going to be tomorrow morning.
Okay.
It's not work, but I mean, I'm well versed in the stuff that Tony does, and so this cruise that he's doing, I'm part of the sister circle, and we're actually working on some creative writing. Mary Prince is one of the subjects, so I'm going to make sure that me and my sisters all go on Tony's cruise.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I'm going to inform you all that AQA GCSE history, in that specification, there was a section, so this is before tomorrow, I'm going to just inform you, on migration, empires and people. So that's about migration from 790 in its historical context. So I'm just informing you all that that actually happens in the AQA specification as a general thing. But for me, AQA history, GCSE. But for me, I'm hoping to do a PhD on Black British history. I've already put in my proposal to a university in the north about children of the Caribbean diaspora in a particular school. I'm using the archive from the school that I attended a long time ago, but it deals with the education policy, Section 11 of the 1966 Education Act, and how it intended to integrate us in British history. Okay, so that's what I'm hoping to begin.
So you've been inspired to get involved in that?
Well, I've already written the proposal, so that hopefully by tomorrow I'll know whether or not I've been accepted.
On the migration GCSE, we actually heard it. Sorry, no? We'll just the people who wrote the textbook. It's unfortunately it's only an option. It's not mandatory for everybody. But the people who wrote the textbook presented on it at an earlier event in our series. So if you go to our website, you can find a video of them talking all about it. And there's also a great website called Our Migration Story. So it's got lots of stuff aimed at kids for that.
I've got a lot of. Well, I'm not, but I've got some archived newspaper from Jamaica that talks about the recruiting of colonial nurses and the nurses' experiences. And I've spoken to Corker, who would like to share that just to make sure that we're accurate, and I will definitely share that with him tonight.
Okay. Who's next? Who's going to share next report? Two hands.
I'd like to make links with Lisa in terms of the other way, that there's some Scottish ancestors in my family history who went to then Gold Coast, and in terms of you saying about making links and possibly seeing connections between the two, because there's a large, originally, Scottish diaspora in what's now Ghana.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it links to an undercurrent in the room, but I just think to bring more of a sense of what the late Ntozake Shange, African-American player who died 2 weeks ago, called a comeback breath, the force with which you fight various orthodoxies. So I'm continuing to debunk the whole idea of Windrush, which I think is a real assault on our, not just our history, but our sense of ourselves. The Windrush made one accidental journey. The majority of people on board the Windrush were ex-servicemen. And I remember when Arthur first began the meetings around the Windrush, they were held in the West Indian Servicemen's Association down in Clapham. The Windrush itself, that story, is linked to the service that enslaved people and West Indians put into the British military services. And let's not forget, the term West Indian itself is very new. Even in the First World War, it was the West India Regiment. The first West Indians were the white plantation owners, the planters in your dictionary. They were the first West Indians. There's a play, 1771, Richard Cumberland, a restoration comedy called The West Indian. No black people in it. It's about a white man who comes back to England with all the exoticism of the Caribbean, all the money, and of course all the women then sort of scheme to get their daughters to meet him, to marry. It follows a restoration format. This Windrush thing has become almost like the kind of convention which some people tells us that Wilberforce freed the slaves, or Eric Clapton invented reggae. It has to be debunked and fought, because the people who came after came as invitees. They were invited to come to England. The Windrush itself, making that one accidental journey, was about patriots coming back to England, having fought in the war, put themselves in harm's way to defend England against fascism. They then came back to help build the peace. And it's a wholly different narrative, a different story. So my battle, it goes back, I mean, I'm not a historian. History is my basic science, as I work in film as a director and actor. But if I can claim some justification for being here, I was one of the advisors 11 years ago on the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery. And my main concerns were two, narrative and nomenclature. And this idea of a Windrush generation is a tabloidization of our history. It's a kind of myopic solecism about our story in this country. It keeps us distant, it keeps us within an immigrant narrative, and it foreshortens our history in this country. So carrying on from yesterday, today and tomorrow, I'm out to debunk, in my small way, the idea of Windrush as an epochal narrative, epochal name for our presence and link to this country. Rastafari.
Can we add some debunking the language around it as well? Because language is a big
Oh, it all goes. It's all of a piece. It's all of a piece.
So just following on from that, just a reminder that we all heard in the news today or yesterday that Commonwealth citizens can now serve in the British military without any prior residency or whatever, which is pretty amazing if one goes back through.
There were 1 million Punjabis fighting in the First World War, and there wouldn't have been one except for them, for instance. Over 500,000 West Africans fought in Burma to protect this country. I mean, yes,
and they weren't allowed to fight on the European front. Many of them.
But they were fighting for Britain, and they were part of the Empire, Commonwealth, etc.
But my takeaway would be the need to map the walks that are happening in Scotland and in London, but also map the links between the Scottish cities and the Caribbean and Guyana, with the hope of creating walks in those countries for people who visit. And I just, on the Windrush question, I think it's important to remember that the reason this got such a high profile was that the Commonwealth heads of government were meeting in London, and they were all here when the Commonwealth, well, Buckingham Palace wanted to ensure that the Prince of Wales became the next head of the Commonwealth, so nobody wanted an upset, and the heads of government of the Caribbean were there to exercise influence. And I'd wonder if it wouldn't be worth asking some of those heads and some of the High Commissioners in London to comment on this, but I don't know if there are any historians of the Commonwealth and its representation in this country. And then you go back to both India, well, the subcontinent and the Caribbean.
That's a closer link to those people on the Windrush, those Punjabis fighting in the First World War to defend England. That's a closer link than to anything which came after. That's my point.
This side has been very quiet.
Do you know Philip Murphy? I mean, that's the history of the Commonwealth and its perception, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Because you just said you wondered if there were any historians of that here.
No, I'm not. I'm talking more about the attitudes within the High Commissions and especially the Caribbean, who would comment on what happened at Choggin, because we got a result, but the Choggin meetings are all that are effectively in camera or just heads without any accompanying staff. So that would just be an interesting story.
Yeah, I was reminded, one of the presentations, there was a slide on Marcus Garvey,
And I was reminded that when he was asked, are you a Jamaican or an African? He said, I would not exchange a continent for an island. So what I want to do is, especially as we are in the decade for people of African descent, to encourage us to embrace our African identity.
I've worked, as I said, this year on a couple of projects. One of them was the Windrush nurses with my colleagues at Ghana. And the focus was, well, the title is Intergenerational African and Caribbean, but the focus so far has been Caribbean nurses. So I'd like to contribute by looking at some of the African nurses from the continent, such as my mother, who's a midwife, who came around the same period. And there was actually another boat, it wasn't obviously not called Windrush, but there was one which had some traction as the main boat that was used for some of the West African migrants. So find out more about that to add to this conversation.
That's exactly the focus of the Young Historians project that's just been announced on African nurses rather than Caribbean nurses. I've just tweeted that.
Sure. Yeah, my immediate action over the next 3 or 4 days will be to talk to one of the organisers of the International 18th Century Studies Conference in Edinburgh in July, to see if they will build into the programme a version of your walk that's relevant to their interests. But the question I'd like to throw out, as former secretary of BASA, and having deposited BSA's archive with Black Cultural Archives, among other materials, a big question mark for all of us here is what can be done to ensure that Black Cultural Archive doesn't collapse because of its funding.
Well, in response to that, I've been in some email exchanges about that, and apparently it's been reported in the most calamitous terms that it might actually close, but it's slightly less awful in that they're just very precarious and they're clearly seeking secure funding, and one of the things they would like is to have secure funding from the government. But one of the things various bodies and institutions are trying to write letters of support, just really quick, and it's just one of the things they really need is like key examples of where the British Cultural Archives have made an impact or got involved with something or been helpful to the scholarly community or anything. So if you've had any particular case studies or examples of something you think that wouldn't have happened without them, then feed it back to me or someone. That'd be helpful.
Go on.
I'd like to start with an apology first. As somebody who worked in schools as an educator for over this particular role for 20 years, schools that I worked in, my task was to raise the achievement and reduce the exclusion of African Caribbean students. And I did a lot of this, of raising the achievement, but then I was thwarted because the exclusion rates were pointed out to me, and so therefore the attention was shifted. And in doing that, I could no longer be in schools educating lots of people who may well have gone through the British school system about our history, because the focus wasn't there. So I apologise if you went to school in England and you didn't learn about history, because you weren't allowed to. Politics in the staff room. Okay, I'm not writing for academia, I'm not doing any research, but tomorrow I will continue to say Black History Season, not Black History Month, because in schools, October is only 3 weeks. The other week they're on holiday. So for me, it's a season, and the season, from my point of view, is going to start September, October, November, because after that in schools, it's Christmas, and then it's exams. So that's what I'm taking away. Black History Season. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And actually in Essex, in Essex, they're putting all the teachers' insert days into a week, so half term is 2 weeks. So October's only 2 weeks in school. So, just so you know.
Yeah, leading on from what the lady said, I've already started this. On November 26th, we are at City Hall doing something looking at African Jubilee year, and a lot of people, and I met someone who was the head of the ILEA, and they were supposed to be part of what brought about the African Jubilee year, and as a consequence, Black History Month, right? So the fact that people are there does not necessarily mean that they remember. It's a shame that when I say African Jubilee year, it goes over the heads of people. But I'm glad people know about Black History Month. But you know, we've moved past there. We are looking at African History Month and African History Season. In Harrow-wide program for over 5 years, we've been doing African History Season. There's something called the African Jubilee Declaration, which bears our Black History Month. So we have to go back and see why we should talk about African History Month. Particularly when you have people talk about Diversity Month and whatever month. That month was given to focus on the contributions of people of African heritage from antiquity till today. But a season is needed. In fact, the guy that brought up the idea at that table said the idea initially was to go from October into February to align with the American Black History Month, because people in Britain, some of them did mark Black History Month, but not in October, in February. So there was this idea that...
So what's your action?
So my action is to remind people and say, oh, okay, I know what Black History Month, let me hear about the backstory. How can we move forward? So it's focused first of all on history, and it's focused on the experiences of the contributions of Africans. And by African, I mean people of African heritage. It doesn't matter whether it's from the diaspora or from the continent. I use Africa to describe people of African heritage. We need to go there, because when we talk about Black, it just confuses. Only when you talk about Black on Black violence that I know people are focused on Africans. But the rest is so confusing. Let's be focused by what Black History Month is supposed to be about. Or better still, call it African History Month or African History Season. That's my thing.
Any more? Okay.
I was about to take a chance to say thank you for everybody's contributions today. I learned a lot. It was very educational. Moving forward, my contribution would be I'm working on a project in the IHR, and it's basically called Layers of London. It's a map of London that's mapping the different London histories, and basically anything I found out that was new today, which is a lot of biographies, a lot of names I didn't know, I'm not familiar with, I'll be incorporating into the Layers of London map. I'll also be sharing specific names and events with family and friends who I know don't know this history, as a means to, affect change in my small influence of peers. So those are the two things.
Fantastic. Okay, Brandon, we have to wait, sorry. Right, we've got to go now. We've got up at 5:30. 3 things, yeah? The first, fill out your form. Fill out your form. The second is on the back, you should sign up to the directory so you can network to find out, to be part of this Layers of London, be part of this directory. And the last thing, this room is going to be used immediately we get out of it. So we need to vacate quickly, right now. But also take everything with you, take all your